When 78-year-old Raymond Powell was ordered to give up his medically necessary aisle seat to accommodate a last-minute corporate booking, he quietly limped to the cramped middle seat in the back row, his war-damaged leg screaming with every step. The other passengers saw only a stubborn old man holding up their flight, unaware that the shrapnel still lodged in his knee was a souvenir from saving 6 soldiers during a Taliban ambush in Afghanistan. 12 minutes after takeoff was delayed, Captain Kevin Barnes emerged from the cockpit, spotted the elderly veteran hunched in pain in row 28, and stopped dead in his tracks. What the captain did next would transform a routine flight into a moment of recognition that reminded everyone aboard that true heroes often hide in plain sight, and that some debts of honor transcend time, rank, and altitude. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The morning sun cast long shadows across Terminal 4 at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. Raymond Powell sat in the waiting area near Gate A12, his weathered hands folded over a small black duffel bag. At 78, Ray carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen too much but never complained about it. His grey hair was neatly combed, his flannel shirt pressed, and his worn jeans showed the careful attention of someone who took pride in appearance despite limited means. Ray had been at the gate for 2 hours, a habit formed during decades of military service where being early meant being on time, and being on time meant being late. His left leg stretched out slightly, the damaged knee requiring constant adjustment to prevent the sharp pain that came when the old injury stiffened. The shrapnel fragments embedded near his kneecap were a permanent reminder of his last day. In Afghanistan 12 years ago, when everything changed, the boarding announcement crackled through the terminal speakers. Ray reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his boarding pass, worn soft from handling. Seat 12A. He had specifically requested the aisle seat when he booked the flight 3 months earlier, explaining to the reservation agent about his service-connected injury. The extra legroom wasn't a luxury for Ray, it was a necessity. First, glass and premium boarding may now board. Ray watched as well-dressed passengers moved toward the gate. He wasn't in a hurry. His boarding group wouldn't be called for another 15 minutes. He used the time to observe, another old habit. The gate area buzzed with typical airport energy. Business travelers clutched phones and laptops. Families corralled children and carry-on bags. Everyone seemed to be rushing towards something important. Near the gate counter, Ray noticed a commotion. A group of 5 people in expensive suits had gathered around Lisa Parker, the young gate agent. Their leader, a tall man with silver hair and an air of authority, gestured emphatically while speaking in low, urgent tones. Ray couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language was clear. The man was accustomed to getting his way. Group B may now board. Ray stood slowly, gripping the arm of his chair for support. The movement sent a familiar spike of pain through his knee, but he didn't grimace. He had learned long ago that showing weakness invited unwanted attention or pity. Neither sat well with him. The boarding line moved steadily. Ray presented his pass to Lisa Parker, who scanned it with a distracted smile. "Thank you, Mr. Powell. Enjoy your flight." The jet bridge stretched ahead, empty except for the rhythmic hum of air conditioning. Ray's steps echoed softly as he made his way toward the aircraft. Each step was measured, careful. His damaged leg demanded respect, and Ray had learned to listen. The airplane's interior was typical for a Boeing 737. Ray counted rows as he walked down the aisle. Row 8, row 9, row 10. When he reached row 12, he stopped. Seat 12A sat empty, waiting. Ray lifted his duffel bag into the overhead compartment, a movement that required both arms and careful balance. The flight attendant working the forward galley, a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, glanced his way but didn't offer assistance. Ray settled into seat 12A with relief. The aisle seat provided exactly what he needed: room to extend his damaged leg, space to shift position when the pain flared, access to stand and stretch during the 4-hour flight to Washington. He had flown this route before to attend military funerals and veteran gatherings. Each trip was a pilgrimage of sorts, a chance to honor those who didn't make it home. This trip was different. This trip was personal. Ray pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. The funeral program was simple, printed on cream-colored cardstock. Sergeant David Mitchell, United States Army, February 15th, 1985, March 12th, 2024. Below the dates was a photograph of a young soldier in dress blues, ribbons and medals precisely arranged, eyes bright with the confidence of someone who believed he would live forever. Dave Mitchell had been 27 when he died. Not from enemy fire or roadside bombs, but from cancer that the doctors had probably started during his deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. The same cancer that had claimed too many of Ray's brothers in the years since their return. Dave had fought the disease with the same determination he had shown in combat, but some battles couldn't be won with courage alone. Ray folded the program carefully and returned it to his pocket. Tomorrow, at Arlington National Cemetery, he would stand with other veterans and watch as Dave Mitchell was laid to rest with full military honors. Ray would salute his fallen brother one last time, just as he had promised when they served together at Forward Operating Base Chapman. The boarding process continued around Ray. Passengers filed past, stowing bags and settling into seats. Most ignored him completely, seeing only an elderly man taking up space. A few nodded politely. None recognized the quiet dignity of someone who had served his country with distinction for 32 years. "Excuse me, is this 12B?" Ray looked up to see a middle-aged woman checking her boarding pass. She had kind eyes and graying hair, the sort of person who probably taught school or worked in a library. "Yes, ma'am. Right here next to me. Thank you. I'm Maria Santos, flying to see my daughter graduate from Georgetown. Congratulations. That's quite an achievement." Maria settled into her seat, arranging a small purse and water bottle in the seat pocket. "Are you traveling for business or pleasure?" Ray paused. The truth was neither simple nor pleasant. "A funeral, military funeral." Maria's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Family?" "Brother-in-arms." The phrase carried weight that civilians rarely understood. Brother-in-arms meant more than friend, more than colleague. It meant someone who had shared foxholes and firefights, someone who had trusted you with his life and earned the same trust in return. When brothers-in-arms died, a piece of the survivor died with them. The gate area had grown crowded. Ray watched through the small airplane window as ground crews loaded luggage and performed pre-flight checks. The routine was familiar and comforting. Order and procedure, the same principles that had guided his military career. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a slight delay this morning while we resolve a seating issue. We appreciate your patience." The announcement came from Christina Moore, the flight attendant Ray had noticed earlier. Her voice carried the practiced calm of someone accustomed to managing problems, but Ray detected an undercurrent of stress. He glanced toward the front of the cabin and saw the source of the delay. The group from the gate counter had boarded. 5 people in expensive business attire, led by the silver-haired man who had been gesturing at the gate agent. They stood in the forward aisle, blocking other passengers while engaged in animated conversation with Christina Moore and another flight attendant, an older woman with supervisor stripes on her uniform. Ray couldn't hear the specific words, but the tone was clear. The corporate group was making demands. The flight crew was trying to accommodate them while managing the increasingly restless passengers waiting to board. "This is ridiculous," Maria Santos whispered. Some people think the world revolves around them. Ray didn't respond, but he understood the sentiment. He had encountered entitled behavior throughout his life, in the military and as a civilian. The difference was that in the army, such behavior was quickly corrected. In the civilian world, money and position often trumped courtesy and consideration. The conversation at the front of the cabin grew more intense. Ray caught fragments of words: corporate account, upgrade requirements, unacceptable arrangements. The silver-haired man's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having his demands met immediately. Christina Moore approached their row, tablet in hand, and expression carefully neutral. Ray had seen that look before, on the faces of young soldiers tasked with delivering bad news to superior officers. It was the look of someone caught between duty and impossibility. "Excuse me, Mr. Powell?" Ray looked up, surprised to hear his name. "Yes, I need to speak with you about your seat assignment." The words carried an ominous weight. Ray glanced at Maria Santos, who was pretending to read a magazine while obviously listening to every word. "My seat assignment? Yes, sir. We have a situation that requires some passenger adjustments. I need to ask if you would be willing to consider a different seat." Ray's military training kicked in. When someone asked if you would be willing to consider something, it meant the decision had already been made. The politeness was merely protocol. What kind of different seat? Christina Moore consulted her tablet, fingers swiping across the screen with practiced efficiency. "We have seat 28F available. It's in our main cabin toward the back of the aircraft." Ray knew airplane layouts well enough to understand what 28F meant. Middle seat, last few rows, minimal legroom, maximum discomfort for someone with his injury. The kind of seat that would turn a 4-hour flight into an endurance test. Why do I need to move from my assigned seat? We have a corporate group that requires specific seating arrangements for a business meeting during the flight. Management has authorized seat reassignments to accommodate their needs. The explanation was carefully worded, professionally delivered, and completely unacceptable. Ray had paid for seat 12A specifically because of his medical needs. He had booked the flight months in advance, followed all procedures, met all requirements. Now he was being asked to sacrifice his comfort and health for the convenience of last-minute corporate demands. "I reserved this seat for medical reasons," Ray said quietly. "I have a service-connected injury that requires aisle access and additional legroom." Christina Moore's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Discomfort, perhaps, or recognition that she was being asked to do something unreasonable. "I understand, sir, and I apologize for the inconvenience. However, we need to accommodate the corporate group's requirements. They have significant business with the airline." The implication was clear. Corporate money mattered more than individual passenger rights. Ray felt the familiar weight of institutional indifference, the same feeling he had experienced in VA hospitals and government offices where veterans were processed like problems to be solved rather than people to be served. Ray looked around. The cabin. Other passengers were watching now, some openly curious, others pretending to ignore the confrontation while listening to every word. He saw judgment in their faces, the assumption that he was being difficult, that he was holding up their flight for selfish reasons. "What happens if I refuse to move?" Christina Moore's professional mask slipped slightly. "Sir, I really need your cooperation here. We can't delay the flight indefinitely." There it was, the threat beneath the politeness. Move voluntarily, or be blamed for inconveniencing everyone aboard. Ray had faced down Taliban fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan, but this felt different. This felt like betrayal by his own countrymen. Ray looked at Maria Santos, who was watching with obvious sympathy, but saying nothing. He looked at the corporate group, still clustered near the front of the cabin, their expensive suits and confident postures radiating entitlement. He looked at Christina Moore, a young woman just doing her job, but clearly uncomfortable with what she was being asked to do. Finally, Ray unbuckled his seatbelt. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll move." The walk to seat 28F was the longest journey Ray had taken in years. Each step sent jolts of pain through his damaged knee. Passengers turned to watch as he limped down the aisle, his small duffel bag clutched in one weathered hand. Some looked sympathetic. Others seemed annoyed that his slow progress was delaying their departure. Seat 28F was exactly as Ray had imagined. Cramped, uncomfortable, wedged between a college student wearing headphones and a businessman typing aggressively on his laptop. Ray lowered himself into the narrow space, his knee immediately protesting the confined position. The businessman didn't look up from his computer. The college student offered a brief, apologetic smile before returning to his movie. Ray closed his eyes and tried to find a position that didn't hurt. There wasn't one. The flight hadn't even taken off yet, and already his leg was stiffening. 4 hours to Washington, 4 hours of increasing pain, followed by the challenge of walking through Reagan National Airport and making his way to his hotel. He thought about Dave Mitchell, lying in a coffin at Arlington National Cemetery, waiting for tomorrow's service. Dave would have laughed at this situation, probably would have made some joke about civilian entitlement and military perseverance. Dave had always found humor in adversity, a trait that had made him popular with his fellow soldiers and effective under pressure. Ray pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact labeled Jenny P.M. His daughter, Jennifer Powell Morrison, lived in Colorado with her husband and son. She had urged Ray to take this trip, knowing how much Dave Mitchell's friendship had meant to him during their deployment. Jenny worried about her father. The way he had withdrawn after her mother's death, the way he seemed to be fading into invisibility. He typed a brief message. "Flight delayed, but boarding now. Will call when I land." Jenny's response came quickly. "Love you, Dad. Dave would be proud you're making the trip." Ray smiled despite his discomfort. His daughter understood the importance of honoring fallen brothers. She had grown up in a military family, had seen the bonds forged by shared service and sacrifice. Jenny knew that this trip wasn't just about attending a funeral. It was about keeping faith with the living and the dead. 3 rows ahead, in the business section of the cabin, Diana Russell watched the elderly man struggle into his cramped seat. Diana was a corporate executive herself, flying from Phoenix to Washington for a merger negotiation. She had watched the entire confrontation between the veteran and the flight crew, and what she had witnessed made her furious. Diana understood corporate priorities. She had spent 15 years climbing the ladder at Russell & Associates, a consulting firm that specialized in government contracts. She knew how business relationships worked, how money talked, how influence operated. But she also understood right and wrong, and what had just happened was clearly wrong. The elderly man had been polite throughout the confrontation. He had explained his medical needs clearly and reasonably. He had offered no resistance beyond asking legitimate questions, and he had been steamrolled by a system that prioritized corporate convenience over individual dignity. Diana pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Margaret Foster, CEO of the airline. They had worked together on several projects, and Margaret owed Diana more than one favor. This seemed like an appropriate time to collect. But before Diana could place the call, she noticed movement in the forward galley. Christina Moore was speaking urgently into a phone, her expression troubled. The older flight attendant with supervisor stripes was listening intently, occasionally nodding or asking questions. Something was happening beyond the simple seating dispute. Diana could feel the energy shift, the way it did when important people began paying attention to problems that had previously been ignored. In the cockpit, Captain Kevin Barnes was reviewing the pre-flight checklist when his phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret Foster herself. Passenger issue needs immediate attention. Ray Powell, seat 28F, corporate override of veterans medical accommodation. Handle appropriately. Kevin frowned at the message. Margaret Foster didn't typically involve herself in seating disputes. The fact that she was reaching out personally suggested this was more than a routine passenger complaint. Kevin had served 12 years in Army aviation before transitioning to commercial flying. He understood military culture, veteran issues, and the importance of treating former service members with respect. If a veteran had been mistreated aboard his aircraft, Kevin intended to make it right. He turned to his co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Walsh. "Marcus, I need you to handle the pre-flight communication with ground control. I have a passenger issue to resolve." Marcus nodded. "Everything okay, Captain?" "It will be." Kevin unbuckled his harness and stood. The cockpit door opened with a soft hiss, and Captain Kevin Barnes stepped into the passenger cabin. His appearance immediately drew attention. The 4 gold stripes on his shoulders, the command presence that came with years of leadership experience, the serious expression that suggested something important was about to happen. Kevin's eyes swept the cabin, taking in the corporate group. Clustered in the premium seats, the nervous flight attendants and the passengers watching with various degrees of curiosity and concern. Finally, his gaze settled on row 28, where an elderly man sat hunched in obvious discomfort. Kevin had seen that posture before, in VA hospitals and veterans centers. It was the way old soldiers sat when they were hurting, but too proud to complain. It was the way his own father had sat during the final years of his life, after shrapnel from Korea had finally taken its toll. Captain Barnes began walking down the aisle, his measured steps echoing through the suddenly quiet cabin. Every passenger, every crew member, every person aboard that aircraft sensed that something significant was about to happen. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for whatever came next. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Captain Kevin Barnes reached row 28 and stopped. The elderly man looked up, his weathered face showing confusion mixed with resignation. Kevin had served long enough to recognize that expression. It was the look of someone who had been disappointed by institutions too many times to expect anything. "Different, Mr. Powell?" Ray nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. I'm Captain Barnes. I understand there was some confusion about your seat assignment." The businessman, typing on his laptop, finally looked up, annoyed by the interruption. The college student paused his movie and removed one earbud, sensing the gravity of the moment. Around the cabin, conversations died as passengers strained to listen. "No confusion, Captain," Ray said quietly. "Just corporate priorities." Kevin crouched beside the aisle seat, bringing himself to Ray's eye level. The gesture was deliberate, respectful. In the military, leaders didn't tower over subordinates. When delivering important news, "Tell me what happened." Ray shifted uncomfortably in the cramped seat, his knee sending sharp reminders of its limitations. "I booked seat 12A 3 months ago. Paid extra because of a service-connected injury. Young lady came by and said I needed to move for a corporate group, so I moved. Did you explain your medical accommodation?" "Yes, sir. Didn't matter." Kevin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 23 years of military service had taught him the difference between necessary sacrifice and institutional failure. This felt like the latter. "What branch did you serve?" "In Mr. Powell, Army Special Forces, 32 years active duty." The businessman's typing stopped completely. The college student pulled out his other earbud. Even passengers several rows away leaned forward, suddenly understanding that this conversation was about more than airline policies. "Where did you serve?" "Lots of places. Last deployment was Afghanistan. Forward Operating Base Chapman, 2012. Kevin's expression changed. Fob Chapman had been hit hard during the drawdown years. American forces were consolidating, pulling back, leaving behind equipment and sometimes people. It had been a dangerous time for everyone, but especially for Special Forces units conducting the most sensitive operations. "What happened to your leg?" Ray hesitated. He didn't usually discuss the injury with strangers. The details were too complicated, too painful, too bound up with memories of friends who didn't make it home. IED, March 15th, 2012. We were extracting a wounded soldier when the device detonated. Shrapnel went through my knee, shattered the joint. Kevin nodded. He had flown casualty evacuation missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. He had seen what IEDs could do to human bodies, had transported broken soldiers to field hospitals where doctors performed miracles with limited resources. "The soldier you were extracting, did he make it?" Ray's eyes grew distant. "Yes, sir. Sergeant Luis Barnes. Took some doing, but we got him out." The color drained from Kevin's face. He sat back on his heels, suddenly unsteady. Round the cabin, passengers watched the captain's reaction with growing curiosity and concern. "Luis Barnes was my brother." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Ray stared at Kevin, his mind racing through memories of that terrible day. The B ambush in the mountain pass, the desperate fight to reach Luis, who had been hit by sniper fire and pinned down behind a damaged Humvee, the explosion that had ended Ray's military career but saved Luis's life. "Your brother?" Ray's voice was barely a whisper. "He told me about you. Master Sergeant Powell, the Green Beret who carried him 2 miles through enemy territory with a destroyed knee. He said you saved his life." Ray closed his eyes. Luis Barnes had been 24 years old, a helicopter mechanic who had volunteered for a convoy because they were short-handed. The kid had been scared, talking about his girlfriend back home, about the wedding they were planning when he got back to the States. "How is Luis?" Kevin's expression grew solemn. He died 6 months later, not from his wounds, from complications during surgery back home, but he lived long enough to come home, to marry his girlfriend, to tell his family what you did for him. The admission hit Ray like a physical blow. Another brother lost, another promise broken by an indifferent universe. How many times had he carried wounded soldiers to safety, only to learn months or years later that they had died anyway? How many families had he helped save, only to watch them torn apart by delayed consequences of war? "I'm sorry," Ray said. He didn't know. He talked about you all the time, said you were the bravest man he ever met, said you refused medical attention until every other wounded soldier had been treated. Kevin stood and turned toward the front of the cabin, his command, voice carrying clearly through the aircraft. "Ms. Moore, I need to see you immediately." Christina Moore approached quickly, her tablet clutched defensively against her chest. Behind her, Elena Rodriguez, the senior flight attendant, followed with obvious concern. "Yes, Captain?" "Explain to me why a decorated combat veteran was forced to give up his medically necessary seat." Christina glanced nervously toward the corporate group in the premium section. Douglas Fitzgerald was watching the exchange with obvious displeasure. His expensive suit and gold watch, marking him as someone accustomed to having his demands met without question. "Sir, we received instructions from ground operations to accommodate the Fitzgerald Industries Group. They have significant business with the airline." "Did you verify Mr. Powell's medical accommodation?" The corporate booking took priority. Kevin's voice remained calm, but his words carried the weight of absolute authority. "Ms. Moore, in my aircraft, medical accommodations take priority over corporate convenience. Always." Elena Rodriguez stepped forward, recognizing the need for damage control. "Captain, we can certainly work something out. Perhaps we can find alternative seating for the corporate group." "No." Kevin's response was immediate and non-negotiable. Mr. Powell will be returned to his original seat. The corporate group can adjust their arrangements accordingly. From the premium section, Douglas Fitzgerald rose from his seat and approached. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit clearly custom-tailored. Everything about him projected success, influence, and the expectation that his wishes would be accommodated without question. "Captain, I'm Douglas Fitzgerald, CEO of Fitzgerald Industries. We have an urgent business meeting during this flight. Our seating arrangement is critical for confidential discussions." Kevin turned to face the corporate executive, his 4 gold stripes and command presence creating an unmistakable contrast with Fitzgerald's civilian authority. "Mr. Fitzgerald, I understand your business needs. However, this veteran has a medical accommodation that takes precedence over corporate convenience. Do you understand the value of our account with this airline? Do you understand the value of his service to this country?" The exchange was polite, but charged with tension. Around the cabin, passengers watched the confrontation between corporate power and military principle. Cell phones appeared discreetly as people began recording the unprecedented scene. Diana Russell stood from her seat in row 7 and approached the group. Her business attire and confident bearing marked her as someone accustomed to corporate environments, but her expression showed clear disapproval of Fitzgerald's behavior. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts. "I'm Diana Russell from Russell & Associates. Mr. Fitzgerald, I believe your company could demonstrate exceptional corporate citizenship by voluntarily accommodating this veteran's needs." Fitzgerald's eyes narrowed as he recognized a fellow power player. "Ms. Russell, this is a private matter between our group and the airline. Actually, it's a public matter of basic human decency." Kevin appreciated the support but didn't need it. His authority as captain was absolute within the aircraft, and he intended to use it appropriately. "Mr. Fitzgerald, here's what's going to happen. Mr. Powell will be returned to seat 12A immediately. Your group will make alternative arrangements. If that's unacceptable, you're welcome to take the next flight." The businessman who had been sitting next to Ray finally spoke up. "Captain, I have seat 11B. Mr. Powell can have it if it helps resolve this situation." "Thank you for the offer, but Mr. Powell will be returned to his originally assigned seat." Kevin turned back to Ray, who was struggling to rise from the cramped middle seat. The captain immediately extended his arm for support, helping the elderly veteran navigate the narrow aisle space. "Mr. Powell, I apologize on behalf of the airline and personally. This should never have happened." Ray accepted the assistance gratefully, his damaged knee protesting every movement. "No harm done, Captain." "There was harm done. You shouldn't have to fight for basic respect in your own country." As they walked slowly toward the front of the aircraft, Kevin continued speaking in a voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Master Sergeant Raymond Powell, United States Army Special Forces, retired. This man spent 32 years serving our country, including multiple combat deployments. He was wounded in action while saving the life of another soldier." The cabin fell completely silent. Passengers put away their phones and tablets, giving Ray their full attention. Some stood spontaneously as he passed, offering nods of respect and gratitude. On March 15, 2012, Master Sergeant Powell carried my wounded brother 2 miles through enemy territory, despite suffering severe injuries himself. His actions saved Luis's life and allowed him to come home to his family. Ray's steps slowed as they approached row 12. The emotional weight of Kevin's words, combined with the physical effort of walking, was taking its toll. Kevin noticed immediately and adjusted his pace. "My brother told me that Master Sergeant Powell refused medical treatment until every other wounded soldier had been cared for. That's the kind of man we're dealing with here." They reached row 12, where Maria Santos was still seated in 12B. She looked up with obvious emotion, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mr. Powell," she said softly, "it's an honor to have you as my seatmate." Ray lowered himself carefully into seat 12A, immediately feeling the relief of adequate legroom and aisle access. The pain in his knee began to subside as he found a comfortable position. "Thank you, Captain. This wasn't necessary." Yes, it was. Kevin turned to address the entire cabin one more time. "Mr. Powell is traveling to Washington to attend the funeral of a fallen comrade at Arlington National Cemetery, Sergeant David Mitchell, who died of cancer related to his military service. Mr. Powell is making this trip to honor a promise he made to a brother in arms." The silence that followed was profound. Even Douglas Fitzgerald, still standing in the aisle with his corporate group, seemed to recognize the gravity of the moment. Kevin looked directly at Fitzgerald. "Mr. Fitzgerald, I trust your group can find suitable alternative seating arrangements." The corporate executive nodded curtly, his earlier bluster replaced by grudging acknowledgement. "Of course, Captain." As the corporate group dispersed to find new seats, Kevin knelt beside Ray's seat one more time. "Master Sergeant, I want you to know that my brother lived for 6 additional months because of what you did. He got to marry his girlfriend Sarah. He got to see his daughter take her first steps. He got to tell his story to his family, to his friends, to anyone who would listen." Ray's weathered hands gripped the armrest tightly. "What was her name?" "His daughter? Elena Barnes. She's 12 now. She knows your name. She knows what you did for her father." Tears gathered in Ray's eyes, but his voice remained steady. "I wish I could have done more. You did everything possible. You gave him 6 months of life he wouldn't have had otherwise. You gave his family closure, memories, hope." Kevin stood and adjusted his uniform jacket. "This flight will reach Washington on time. I'll make sure of it. And Master Sergeant?" "Yes, sir. Tomorrow, when you stand at Arlington Cemetery, you'll be representing all of us, everyone on this aircraft, everyone." "Who understands the price of freedom?" Ray nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening his throat. Around the cabin, passengers applauded quietly, a sound like distant rain on leaves. It wasn't the loud, theatrical applause of entertainment venues. It was the respectful acknowledgement of people who recognized they were witnessing something important. Kevin returned to the cockpit, leaving Ray to settle into his proper seat with dignity restored and honor acknowledged. The engines spooled up for departure, but the real journey had already begun. The engines reached full throttle as Captain Barnes guided the aircraft down the runway. Ray felt the familiar sensation of takeoff, the moment when tons of metal and machinery defied gravity through human engineering and determination. He had experienced this feeling hundreds of times during his military career, but it never lost its power to remind him of humanity's capacity to overcome limitations. As the plane climbed steadily above Phoenix, Ray gazed through the small window at the desert landscape falling away below. The city's sprawl gave way to mountains and open spaces, the kind of terrain he had learned to navigate during training exercises at Fort Bragg decades ago. Everything looked different from 30,000 feet, more peaceful, less complicated. Maria. Santos settled back in her seat beside him, pulling out a book but not opening it immediately. The events of the past hour had affected everyone in the cabin, creating an atmosphere of quiet reflection that seemed inappropriate to disturb with casual conversation. "Mr. Powell," she said finally, her voice soft enough not to carry to other. "Passengers, I want you to know that what happened here today restored my faith in something I thought was lost." Ray turned from the window. Maria's eyes held the kind of sincerity that came from personal experience with disappointment and unexpected grace. "What's that, Mom?" "The idea that people still stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Ray considered her words carefully. In his experience, most people wanted to do the right thing, but often lacked the courage or opportunity to act on their convictions. Today had been different. Today, several people had chosen principle over convenience. "Captain, Barnes didn't have to do what he did," Ray said. "He could have ignored the situation, let it slide. Most people would have. But he didn't, and that woman, Ms. Russell, she didn't have to speak up either." Ray nodded, thinking about Diana Russell's intervention during the confrontation with Douglas Fitzgerald. She had risked professional consequences to support a stranger's dignity. Such actions were rare in civilian life, though they had been commonplace during his military service. In the army, we called it having each other's backs. Doesn't matter if you've never met someone before. If they're in trouble and you can help, you help. Is that why you're going to Washington? To have someone's back? Ray pulled the folded funeral program from his shirt pocket, handling it with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. The photograph of Sergeant David Mitchell seemed to smile up at him, frozen in a moment of youth and optimism that war had. Tested, but never quite destroyed. Dave Mitchell was my squad leader when I was a young Green Beret. Later, when I made Master Sergeant, he became my responsibility. We served together for 8 years, 3 deployments. He saved my life more times than I can count. Maria glanced at the program, noting the dates that marked a life cut short. He was young. 39 when the cancer took him. Doctors think it started during our deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Agent Orange in Vietnam, burn pits in the Middle East. Every generation of soldiers faces invisible enemies that follow them home. The cabin had settled into the rhythm of cruise flight. Passengers worked on laptops, read books, dozed in their seats. The corporate group had redistributed themselves throughout the aircraft, their urgent business meeting apparently postponed in favor of individual work. Douglas Fitzgerald sat alone in an aisle seat near the front, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been contemplation. 3 rows ahead, Diana Russell was typing on her laptop, but Ray noticed she frequently glanced in his direction. She had positioned herself as his unofficial advocate during the confrontation, and now seemed to be monitoring his welfare with protective concern. The flight attendant call button chimed softly, and Christina Moore approached from the galley. Her earlier defensiveness had been replaced by what appeared to be genuine remorse. "Mr. Powell, can I get you anything? Water, coffee, a snack?" "Coffee would be nice, thank you. How do you take it?" "Black." Christina smiled slightly. "My grandfather always drank his coffee black. Said adding anything to it was like putting ketchup on a good steak." "Smart man. Was he military?" "Navy. World War II, Pacific Theater. He used to tell stories about island hopping, about sailors who looked out for each other no matter what." Ray accepted the coffee gratefully, noting the extra attention Christina was paying to his comfort. People often tried to make amends for institutional failures through small acts of personal kindness. It wasn't enough to erase the original injustice, but it demonstrated awareness that wrongs had been committed. "Your grandfather understood brotherhood," Ray said. "Different service, same principle." Christina nodded and moved on to serve other passengers, but her interaction with Ray had been observed by several nearby travelers. Word was spreading quietly through the cabin about the elderly veteran in row 12, the man who had been mistreated and then honored by the captain's intervention. In row 18, a man in his 40s closed his laptop and stood. He was tall and lean, with the bearing of someone accustomed to discipline and order. His civilian clothes couldn't quite hide the military posture that never fully disappeared from former service members. "Excuse me," he said, approaching Ray's row with obvious purpose. "Master Sergeant Powell?" Ray looked up, immediately recognizing the signs of a fellow veteran. The controlled movement, the respectful tone, the way the man held himself at a position, somewhere between attention and at ease. "That's right. Corporal Marcus Thompson, 3rd Infantry Division. I served in Afghanistan from 2010 to 2012. FOB Shank near Logar Province. Ray's expression shifted to one of recognition and respect. FOB Shank had been hit hard during the drawdown years, surrounded by hostile territory and under constant threat of attack. Soldiers stationed there had faced daily dangers with limited support and uncertain timelines for return home. Corporal Thompson, that was a tough deployment. Yes, sir. We heard stories about special forces operations in our area. Ghost missions, they called them. Teams that went out alone and always brought their people back. Ray didn't respond immediately. Special forces operations during that period had been classified at levels that prevented detailed discussion, even years later. But the broad outlines of their missions were well known among infantry units that had benefited from their effectiveness. We did our job, same as everyone else. Marcus Thompson's expression showed the understanding that came from shared experience. He knew that Ray's modesty concealed operations that had saved countless American lives through precision, courage, and sacrifice that would never be fully acknowledged in public forums. Sir, I just wanted to say that what Captain Barnes did today was right, and what that airline attendant tried to do to you was wrong. A lot of us have been treated like problems to be managed instead of people who earned respect. Other passengers were listening now, drawn into a conversation that revealed the hidden connections between military service members and their ongoing struggles with civilian institutions that often failed to understand their sacrifices. Ray stood carefully, extending his hand to Marcus Thompson. The gesture was formal but warm, the recognition between warriors that transcended rank and unit boundaries. Thank you, Corporal. Your service mattered then, and your support matters now. The handshake lasted several seconds, conveying understanding that couldn't be expressed in words. Around them, the cabin had grown quiet as passengers witnessed an exchange that spoke to bonds forged in dangerous places under circumstances most civilians could never fully comprehend. As Marcus Thompson returned to his seat, Ray noticed movement in the aisle. An elderly man with white hair and a carefully pressed polo shirt was approaching, his walk unsteady but determined. Behind him, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a concerned expression followed closely. Master Sergeant Powell? Yes, sir. Colonel Frank Morrison, retired Army Corps of Engineers. This is my daughter, Captain Jennifer Walsh, active duty. Ray stood again, this time offering a salute that Colonel Morrison returned with precision despite his age. Captain Walsh stepped forward, her uniform bearing the insignia of a staff officer with multiple deployment ribbons. Sir, my father insisted on introducing himself. He served in Vietnam with several special forces units and has tremendous respect for Green Berets. Colonel Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded large units under difficult circumstances. Master Sergeant, I was at Firebase Charlie in 1970 when a Special Forces team extracted my wounded engineers from an overrun position. Never got to thank them properly. Different team, different war, sir. But the mission was always the same. Bring everyone home. Bring everyone home. The phrase resonated through the cabin like a prayer. It was the unofficial motto of Special Forces units, the principle that guided every operation and shaped every decision. No one left behind, no matter the cost, no matter the risk. Captain Walsh spoke quietly, her professional composure not quite hiding the emotion in her voice. Sir, I'm currently stationed at Walter Reed, working with wounded warriors. We see the long-term effects of combat injuries every day. What you did for Captain Barnes's brother, carrying him out despite your own wounds, that's the standard we try to live up to. Ray felt the weight of their expectations, the way military people look to special forces operators as examples of what was possible when training, courage, and determination combined under extreme pressure. He had never been comfortable with Hero worship, preferring to see himself as a soldier who had done his job to the best of his ability. Captain, the real heroes are the ones who didn't make it home. I was lucky. I got to serve with good people and survive long enough to retire. Colonel Morrison nodded slowly. That's exactly what a real hero would say. As the father and daughter returned to their seats, Ray noticed that their public conversation had prompted other passengers to reassess their understanding of military service and sacrifice. Cell phones had appeared throughout the cabin, not for entertainment, but for research, as people looked up information about Special Forces operations, Afghanistan deployments, and the ongoing challenges faced by veterans. Diana Russell closed her laptop and approached, her business attire and confident bearing marking her as someone accustomed to navigating complex professional environments. Mr. Powell, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to follow up on what happened earlier. No intrusion at all, ma'am. I've been thinking about corporate responsibility and how companies should treat veterans. Your situation today highlighted some serious problems with policies that prioritize revenue over respect. Ray appreciated her concern, but didn't want to dwell on corporate failures when the immediate problem had been resolved. Captain Barnes made it right. That's what matters. But it shouldn't have happened in the first place, and it probably happens to other veterans who don't have advocates speaking up for them. Diana's observation touched on something Ray had experienced throughout his transition to civilian life. Veterans often faced institutional indifference or outright hostility from organizations that viewed their military experience as irrelevant or even problematic. The assumption seemed to be that former service members should adapt to civilian expectations without expecting any accommodation for their sacrifices. Change happens slowly, Ray said. One person at a time, one situation at a time. Maybe, but sometimes change requires people with influence to use that influence appropriately. Diana handed Ray a business card embossed with the logo of Russell and Associates. I work with government contractors, companies that depend on military relationships for their success. I'm going to make sure this incident becomes a case study in how to treat veterans properly. Ray accepted the card, noting the contact information and professional credentials that indicated Diana Russell was indeed someone with influence in corporate and government circles. I appreciate that, Ms. Russell, but I don't want to be the poster child for veteran mistreatment. You don't have to be. The story speaks for itself. Corporate arrogance, veteran dignity, military leadership stepping up to do the right thing. It's a narrative that can educate people about issues they might not otherwise consider. As Diana returned to her seat, Ray reflected on the unexpected consequences of what had started as a simple seating dispute. His desire for anonymity and quiet dignity had been replaced by unwanted visibility and public attention. But perhaps that visibility could serve a larger purpose, drawing attention to the experiences of veterans who lacked advocates or allies. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom system. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into the Washington area. Weather is clear, visibility unlimited. We should be on the ground at Reagan National Airport in approximately 30 minutes. Ray looked out the window as the landscape below began to change from open country to suburban development to the familiar outline of the nation's capital. Somewhere down there at Arlington National Cemetery, Sergeant David Mitchell waited for tomorrow's ceremony that would mark the end of his earthly service and the beginning of his eternal rest among America's honored dead. The funeral would bring together Special Forces operators from different eras, different conflicts, different generations. They would stand together in their dress uniforms, rendering final honors to a brother who had served with distinction and died too young. Ray would be among them, representing not just his own grief, but the collective sorrow of warriors who understood that freedom's price was always paid in blood and tears. As the aircraft continued its descent toward Washington, Ray closed his eyes and tried to prepare himself for tomorrow's ordeal. Saying goodbye to Dave Mitchell would mean confronting his own mortality, acknowledging that the brotherhood forged in combat was slowly being diminished by time, disease, and the inevitable consequences of a lifetime spent in service to others. But first, he would have to survive the landing, navigate the airport, and find his way to the hotel where other veterans were gathering to share memories and prepare for the morning ceremony. Thanks to Captain Barnes's intervention, he would arrive with his dignity intact and his faith in human decency restored. The Potomac River appeared below like a silver ribbon threading through the landscape of Northern Virginia. Ray watched the familiar landmarks emerge from the afternoon haze: the Jefferson Memorial's dome catching sunlight, the Washington Monument rising like a marble spear, the Pentagon's distinctive geometric outline near the riverbank. Each site carried memories of previous visits to this sacred ground where America honored its fallen heroes. Captain Barnes's voice filled the cabin with professional calm. "Flight attendants, please prepare for landing. We'll be touching down at Reagan National in 12 minutes. Ray felt the aircraft's descent in his damaged knee, the change in cabin pressure triggering the dull ache that never completely disappeared. He shifted slightly in seat 12A, grateful once again for the legroom that made the discomfort manageable. Beside him, Maria Santos was gathering her belongings, carefully placing her book in her carry-on bag. "Mr. Powell," she said quietly, "I hope tomorrow goes as well as it can. I'll be thinking about you and your friend." "Thank you, ma'am. That means more than you know." The simple exchange reflected something that had developed during the flight, a sense of community among passengers who had witnessed extraordinary events. The initial conflict over seating had transformed into a shared experience of watching dignity restored and honor recognized. People who had boarded as strangers now felt connected by their presence, at a moment when institutional failure had been corrected by individual courage. In row 6, Douglas Fitzgerald closed his laptop and stared out the window. The corporate executive had remained quiet for most of the flight, apparently processing the confrontation with Captain Barnes and its implications for his worldview. His initial arrogance had given way to something that might have been reflection, though his expression remained carefully controlled. 3 seats behind Fitzgerald, Diana Russell finished typing an email on her phone. She had spent the latter portion of the flight documenting the incident, not for publicity, but for corporate education. Her message was addressed to Margaret Foster, the airline's CEO, outlining specific policy recommendations for handling veteran accommodations in the future. "Dear Margaret," she had written, "today's incident involving Master Sergeant Powell highlights systemic problems with how airlines handle medical accommodations for veterans. I'm attaching a proposal for sensitivity training and revised policies that could prevent similar situations while demonstrating corporate respect for military service." Diana's approach was characteristically direct and practical. Rather than simply complaining about problems, she was proposing solutions that addressed root causes while protecting airline interests. Her 15 years in corporate consulting had taught her that sustainable change required alignment between moral imperatives and business objectives. The landing gear extended with a mechanical rumble that Ray felt through the aircraft structure. He had experienced this sensation countless times during military flights, but commercial landings always seemed gentler, more civilized than the tactical approaches he remembered from combat zones, where pilots descended rapidly to avoid ground fire. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're on final approach to Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. Please ensure your seatbacks and tray tables are in their upright positions." Christina Moore moved through the cabin, checking compliance with landing. procedures, but when she reached Ray's row, she paused for a moment longer than necessary. "Master Sergeant, I wanted to apologize again for what happened earlier. It won't happen again." Ray looked up at the young flight attendant, noting the sincerity in her expression. "Ms. Moore, you were doing your job as you understood it. Sometimes systems fail, but people can choose to do better." Christina nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. "My grandfather would have liked you. He always said that real strength was helping others when you had every right to be angry." As Christina continued her pre-landing checks, Ray thought about the wisdom contained in her grandfather's observation. Military training emphasized controlled aggression and tactical violence, but the truest test of character often came in moments when restraint and grace were more difficult than retaliation. The aircraft touched down smoothly on Reagan National's runway, the wheels kissing the tarmac with barely a bump. Ray felt the engine's reverse thrust as Captain Barnes brought the aircraft to taxi speed, navigating toward the gate with practiced precision. "Welcome to Washington, D.C., where the local time is 2:47 p.m. and the temperature is a pleasant 68 degrees. As passengers began gathering their belongings, Ray remained seated, allowing the usual post-landing chaos to unfold around him. His military experience had taught him patience in crowded situations, and his damaged knee appreciated the opportunity to adjust gradually to movement after hours of sitting. Marcus Thompson appeared in the aisle beside Ray's row, his carry-on bag slung over his shoulder and a business card in his hand. "Master Sergeant, I wanted to give you this before we deplane. I work for a veterans advocacy organization here in D.C. If you ever need anything at all, please, don't hesitate to call." Ray accepted the card, noting the logo of the Veterans Action Coalition and Thompson's title as Director of Outreach Services. "Thank you, Corporal. It's good to know there are people working on these issues." "Sir, there are a lot of us who remember what it was like coming home to a country that didn't always understand what we'd been through. We're trying to make it better for the next generation." Thompson's words resonated with Ray's own experiences. During the transition from military to civilian life, the assumption that veterans should seamlessly integrate into society without accommodation for their service-related injuries or psychological adjustments had created unnecessary hardships. For thousands of former service members, Colonel Morrison and Captain Walsh approached from their seats near the front of the aircraft. The elderly colonel moved slowly but with determination, while his daughter maintained a protective position at his elbow. "Master Sergeant Powell," Colonel Morrison said, "Jennifer and I are attending a ceremony at Arlington tomorrow morning. Different section, but we'll be thinking about you and Sergeant Mitchell." Captain Walsh extended her hand to Ray with military formality. "Sir, if you're comfortable sharing, could you tell me something about Sergeant Mitchell? I like to know. About the warriors we're honoring." Ray considered the request carefully. Dave Mitchell's story was both intensely personal and representative of thousands of soldiers who had served with distinction only to face invisible enemies upon their return home. Dave was the kind of NCO who made everyone around him better. He could read terrain like a book, plan operations that minimized risk while maximizing effectiveness. But more than that, he cared about his people. Never asked anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. Captain Walsh nodded, recognizing the description of exceptional military leadership. What was his specialty? Communications and intelligence. Dave could intercept enemy radio traffic, translate conversations in real time, and coordinate air support with precision that saved lives. He was also one of the best marksmen I ever served with. Colonel Morrison's expression showed appreciation for technical military skills that had been essential to Special Forces operations in hostile territory. Men like that were worth their weight in gold during combat operations. Yes, sir. Dave volunteered for the most dangerous missions because he knew his skills could make the difference between success and catastrophe. He never hesitated when lives were on the line. As passengers continued filing toward the exit, Ray pulled out his phone and scrolled to a photograph he had saved from Dave Mitchell's last visit to Arizona 2 years earlier. The image showed two elderly men standing beside a fishing boat on Lake Powell, their weathered faces creased with laughter at some shared joke. This was Dave 6 months before his diagnosis, Ray said, showing the photograph to Captain Walsh. And Colonel Morrison, he'd retired to Colorado, bought a small cabin near Estes Park, said he wanted to spend his remaining years in the mountains, away from the noise and complications of city life. Captain Walsh studied the photograph, noting the genuine happiness in both men's faces. He looks like someone who found peace after war. For a while, yes. Dave married a good woman, Sarah, who understood his need for quiet spaces and simple routines. They had 5 years together before the cancer started. Ray's voice carried the weight of watching a strong man diminished by an enemy that couldn't be fought with conventional weapons. Cancer had attacked Dave Mitchell with relentless efficiency, targeting organs and systems that had survived combat unscathed. The doctors at the VA said it was probably related to burn pit exposure during our deployments, Ray continued. Toxic smoke from burning waste, chemicals we breathed for months at a time. Nobody warned us about long-term consequences. Colonel Morrison's expression darkened with understanding. Agent Orange in Vietnam, Gulf War syndrome in Iraq, burn pits. In Afghanistan, every generation discovers new ways that war follows soldiers home. The aircraft had nearly emptied, leaving only a few passengers gathering their belongings from overhead compartments. Ray stood carefully, testing his knee's response to movement after the long flight. The joint protested, but held, stiff, but functional. Diana Russell approached with her laptop bag and a determined expression. Mr. Powell, I've been thinking about what happened today and what it represents for veteran treatment in corporate America. Ms. Russell, I appreciate your concern, but I don't want to become a symbol or a cause. You already are a symbol, whether you want to be or not. The question is whether that symbol represents injustice or the possibility of doing better. Diana's observation was uncomfortably accurate. Ray's preference for anonymity had been compromised the moment Captain Barnes made his public intervention. The story would inevitably spread beyond the aircraft, carrying implications for how other veterans might be treated in similar situations. What do you have in mind? A quiet conversation with airline executives about policy changes that could prevent future incidents. Nothing dramatic, nothing that exploits your personal story, just practical recommendations based on today's experience. Ray considered Diana's proposal while retrieving his duffel bag from the overhead compartment. The weight of the bag reminded him of countless military movements, times when everything he owned had to fit in a single container that could be carried at a moment's notice. Ms. Russell, if you think it might help other veterans, I'm willing to participate, but I won't be turned into a poster child for corporate reform. Understood. I'll handle the corporate discussions. You focus on honoring your friend tomorrow. As they moved toward the aircraft exit, Captain Barnes emerged from the cockpit to bid farewell to passengers. When he saw Ray approaching, the captain's expression brightened with genuine warmth. Master Sergeant Powell, it was an honor having you aboard. I hope the rest of your journey goes smoothly. Ray extended his hand to Captain Barnes, gripping it firmly. Captain, what you did today meant more than just getting my seat back. You reminded everyone on this aircraft that service matters, that respect is earned, and that some debts transcend individual circumstances. You earned that respect 32 years ago when you first put on the uniform. I just made sure it was acknowledged. As Ray stepped off the aircraft and entered the jet bridge, he felt the weight of tomorrow's ceremony settling over him like a familiar burden. Arlington National Cemetery waited just across the Potomac River, its white headstones marking the resting places of America's honored dead. Among them, a new grave had been prepared for Sergeant David Mitchell, a warrior who had served with distinction and died too young. The terminal buzzed with typical airport activity, travelers rushing to connections, families reuniting, business people checking phones and laptops. Ray moved through the chaos at his own pace, his damaged knee requiring careful navigation of the crowded concourses and moving walkways. At baggage claim, he spotted Marcus Thompson waiting near the carousel, apparently in no hurry to leave. When Thompson saw Ray, he approached with purpose. "Master Sergeant, my organization maintains a transportation service for veterans visiting Arlington. If you need a ride to your hotel or to the cemetery tomorrow, we'd be honored to provide it." Ray appreciated the offer, but preferred maintaining his independence when possible. "Thank you, Corporal. I have arrangements, but it's good to know. The support is available. Sir, there's something else. Word is already spreading about what happened on the flight today. Social media, veteran networks, military blogs. You're going to get attention whether you want it or not." Thompson's warning confirmed Ray's suspicions about the incident's potential consequences. In an era of instant communication and viral stories, privacy was often impossible to maintain, especially when the narrative involved corporate misconduct and military honor. What kind of attention? Mostly positive. Veterans supporting your dignity, civilians expressing outrage about your treatment, calls for airline policy changes, but also some criticism about special treatment and playing the victim card. Ray nodded, unsurprised by the predictable range of reactions. Public discourse about military issues often divided along political and cultural lines, with little room for nuanced understanding of veteran experiences. "Corporal, I've survived worse than internet comments, but I appreciate the heads up." As Ray collected his single piece of luggage and headed toward ground transportation, he reflected on the unexpected complexity that had emerged from a simple flight to Washington. What had begun as a personal pilgrimage to honor a fallen friend had evolved into a public discussion about veteran treatment and corporate responsibility. Tomorrow, at Arlington National Cemetery, he would stand with other Special Forces veterans and render final honors to Dave Mitchell. The ceremony would be solemn, dignified, and focused on remembrance rather than contemporary controversies. But Ray now understood that his presence at the funeral would carry additional weight, representing not just his personal grief, but the ongoing struggle for veteran recognition and respect in American society. The taxi ride to his hotel took him through familiar Washington neighborhoods, past monuments and memorials that marked significant moments in American military history. Each landmark reminded Ray of the continuity between past and present, the unbroken chain of service that connected his generation to those who had served before and those who would serve in the future. Tomorrow would bring closure for Dave Mitchell's earthly service and continuation of his legacy in the memories of those who had served alongside him. Ray's role in that ceremony had been predetermined months ago when he had promised to attend. But his role in the larger conversation about veteran dignity was still being written, shaped by forces beyond his control and choices that remained to be made. The Holiday Inn Express near Arlington sat like a quiet island amid the urban bustle of Northern Virginia. Ray's taxi pulled up to the entrance as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. The hotel had been chosen specifically for its proximity to Arlington National Cemetery and its reputation for accommodating military families. During difficult times, Ray paid the driver and gathered his duffel bag, the familiar weight reminding him of countless hotel arrivals during his 32 years of active duty. Some things never changed. The slightly worn lobby carpet, the smell of industrial coffee, the mix of business travelers and families that populated mid-range hotels near major cities. The desk clerk, a young man with neatly trimmed hair and respectful bearing, looked up as Ray approached the check-in counter. "Good afternoon, sir. Checking in. Raymond Powell. I have a reservation." The clerk's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Yes, Mr. Powell. I have you here for 2 nights. Are you in town for the ceremony tomorrow?" The question wasn't casual curiosity. The hotel staff had clearly been briefed about the military funeral taking place at Arlington, and they recognized the signs of arriving veterans, the careful posture, the controlled movements, the weight of grief carried with dignity. "Yes, Sergeant David Mitchell." "I'm sorry for your loss, sir. Several other gentlemen have checked in. For the same ceremony, they're gathering in the conference room if you'd like to join them." Ray accepted his room key and considered the invitation. Part of him wanted solitude, time to process the day's events and prepare emotionally for tomorrow's ordeal. But another part recognized the value of shared grief, the way military brotherhood could ease individual burdens through collective remembrance. "What room number?" "Conference room B, just down the hall past the elevators." Ray made his way to his room first, a modest space with standard hotel furnishings and a view of the parking lot. He set his duffel bag on the bed and opened it carefully, revealing the contents he had packed for this trip. A pressed dress uniform with ribbons and medals precisely arranged, a folded American flag that had covered his wife's coffin 5 years earlier, and a small wooden box containing mementos from his service with Dave Mitchell. The dress uniform still fit, though not as comfortably as it had during his active duty years. The weight of age and accumulated injuries had changed his body's proportions, but the uniform remained a symbol of identity that transcended physical limitations. Tomorrow he would wear it with pride, representing not just his own service, but the brotherhood that had shaped his life's most meaningful relationships. Ray's phone buzzed with an incoming call from his daughter, Jennifer. Her contact photo showed a smiling woman in her 40s, with Ray's eyes and her mother's gentle expression. "Dad, did you make it to Washington okay?" "Just checked into the hotel. Flight was interesting." "Interesting how?" Ray hesitated, unsure how to explain the day's events without worrying his daughter unnecessarily. Jennifer already carried enough concern about his physical health and social isolation. Adding corporate confrontations and unwanted publicity would only increase her anxiety. Had a seating issue that got resolved. Met some good people, including the pilot who knew someone I served with in Afghanistan. "That's amazing. Small world, especially in the military community." Jennifer's voice carried the warmth of someone who understood military connections and their lasting importance. She had grown up in a military family, had experienced the unique bonds that formed between service members and their families. "How are Tyler and the family?" "Tyler's doing well at the academy. He keeps asking about your deployment stories, wants to know what real combat was like." Ray smiled at the mention of his grandson, a 23-year-old cadet at West Point who represented the next generation of military leadership. Tyler possessed the intelligence and character necessary for command, but Ray worried about the challenges facing modern military officers in an increasingly complex world. Tell him the important stories aren't about combat. They're about the people you serve with, the bonds you form, the way you take care of each other when everything goes wrong. "I will, Dad. Are you ready for tomorrow?" The question touched on emotions Ray had been avoiding since boarding the flight in Phoenix. Tomorrow would mark the end of a friendship that had sustained him through the worst periods of his military career and civilian transition. Saying goodbye to Dave Mitchell meant acknowledging his own mortality and the inevitable dissolution of the brotherhood that had defined his adult life. "I'm as ready as anyone can be for something like this. Dad, I wish I could be there with you." Jenny, you have your own family and responsibilities. Besides, this is something I need to do alone. It's between me and Dave and the other guys who served with us." After ending the call, Ray sat quietly in the hotel room, processing the conversation and the emotions it had stirred. His relationship with Jennifer was close but complicated by his reluctance to burden her with his struggles. Military families often carried hidden costs, the emotional distance that developed when parents couldn't share their experiences, the way service-related trauma affected relationships across generations. A knock at the door interrupted his reflection. Ray opened it to find a man in his 60s wearing a hotel polo shirt and maintenance department badge. "Mr. Powell, I'm Eddie Martinez, hotel maintenance supervisor. I served in the Army during Desert Storm. Heard you were checking in for the Mitchell ceremony." "That's right." Eddie's expression showed the recognition that passed between veterans, regardless of rank or era of service. "Sir, just wanted you to know that our staff will take care of anything you need. We understand what tomorrow means." "Thank you. That's very considerate. My nephew works as a flight attendant for one of the airlines. He called me about an hour ago, said there was an incident today involving a veteran on a flight from Phoenix. Said the captain made things right." Ray realized that Eddie Martinez's nephew was likely Christina Moore, the flight attendant who had initially demanded his seat change. The military community was small enough that such connections were common, creating networks of mutual support and shared information. "Your nephew did fine. She was caught in a difficult situation and handled it professionally." Eddie nodded, understanding the diplomacy in Ray's response. "Sir, there are about 8 other veterans downstairs in the conference room. Master Sergeant Williams is organizing a memorial gathering for tonight, sharing stories about Sergeant Mitchell. You might want to join them." Ray locked his room and made his way to conference room B, where voices could be heard through the partially open door. He paused briefly, steeling himself for the emotional intensity of reuniting with men who had shared the most dangerous periods of his life. The conference room contained a circle of chairs occupied by 7 men, ranging in age from their late M40s to early 70s. They wore civilian clothes, but carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of career military personnel. Conversations paused as Ray entered, and several men stood in recognition. "Ray Powell, you old bastard." Master Sergeant Williams, now in his late 60s with white hair and laugh lines earned through decades of military humor, crossed the room with arms extended. The embrace that followed was fierce and brief, the kind of greeting reserved for brothers who had shared foxholes and firefights. "Tommy Williams, should have known you'd organize something like this. Dave would have done the same for any of us." Ray looked around the circle, recognizing faces from different periods of his career. Sergeant Major Rodriguez, who had trained new Special Forces recruits at Fort Bragg. Captain Walsh, who had commanded their unit during the Second Iraq deployment. Corporals Anderson and Thompson, young soldiers who had served under Dave Mitchell's leadership during their first combat tours. "Gentlemen," Williams said, addressing the group, "Master Sergeant Powell was Dave's squad leader during his early career, then became his closest friend during their final deployment to Afghanistan." The introduction carried weight beyond simple biography. In Special Forces culture, the relationships between leaders and subordinates evolved into partnerships built on mutual respect and shared sacrifice. Ray and Dave Mitchell had served together long enough to develop the kind of trust that allowed them to operate effectively in situations where conventional military hierarchy was inadequate. Corporal Anderson, now in his early 50s with gray, threading through his dark hair, leaned forward in his chair. "Master Sergeant Dave used to tell stories about your planning skills, how you could look at terrain and see tactical possibilities that nobody else noticed. Dave was the one with the real talent. I just had experience reading maps and understanding." Enemy behavior patterns. Captain Walsh, who had maintained his military bearing despite 20 years of civilian life, shook his head at Ray's modesty. Master Sergeant, I read the after-action reports from your operations. Dave always credited your leadership with minimizing casualties while maximizing mission effectiveness. Ray accepted the praise reluctantly, preferring to focus on Dave Mitchell's contributions rather than his own. Military culture emphasized collective achievement over individual recognition, but it also demanded acknowledgement of exceptional performance when appropriate. Dave saved more lives than any of us will ever know, Ray said. His intelligence work prevented ambushes. His marksmanship eliminated threats before they could engage our people. He volunteered for the most dangerous missions because he knew his skills could make the difference. Sergeant Major Rodriguez, whose weathered face reflected 3 decades of military service, nodded slowly. Dave had that rare combination of technical expertise and tactical instinct. You can train soldiers to be competent, but you can't train them to have the kind of judgment Dave possessed. The conversation continued as each veteran shared memories of Dave Mitchell's service, building a collective portrait of a soldier who had excelled at every level of military responsibility. Stories emerged about his humor during difficult deployments, his patience with younger soldiers, his dedication to mission success without unnecessary risk to his people. Remember the time Dave intercepted Taliban communications about an IED placement? Corporal Thompson asked. He stayed awake for 36 hours straight, monitoring radio traffic and coordinating with bomb disposal teams to clear 3 separate routes. Saved an entire convoy, Captain Walsh added. 47 soldiers who went home to their families because Dave refused to sleep until the threat was neutralized. Ray listened to the stories with growing emotion, recognizing aspects of his friend's character that had been demonstrated consistently throughout their years of service together. Dave Mitchell had possessed the rare combination of technical skill and moral courage that defined truly exceptional military leaders. There's something you should all know, Ray said, breaking into the conversation. Dave's cancer was probably caused by burn pit exposure during our deployments. The VA confirmed it in their final medical assessment. The announcement created a moment of silence as each veteran processed the implications. Burn pits had been used throughout Iraq and Afghanistan to dispose of military waste, creating toxic smoke that soldiers breathed for months at a time. The long-term health consequences were only beginning to be understood and acknowledged by military medical authorities. How many more of us are going to die from things we were exposed to during deployments? Anderson asked, voicing the fear that haunted many veterans as they aged. Unknown, Captain Walsh replied. But the VE is finally starting to recognize the connections between deployment exposures and subsequent health problems. The conversation shifted to discuss other veterans they had known who had died from cancers, respiratory diseases, and neurological conditions that might have been related to military service. The list was longer than anyone wanted to acknowledge, representing a hidden cost of war that continued decades after combat operations ended. Dave knew he was dying, Ray said quietly. Last time I visited him in Colorado, he told me that he didn't regret his service, didn't blame the military for his condition, said he was proud of what we accomplished and grateful for the friendships that sustained him. Master Sergeant Williams looked around the circle of aging warriors, recognizing the weight of mortality that had settled over their gathering. Dave also said he wanted his funeral to be a celebration of service, not a protest against military policies or government failures. Then that's what tomorrow will be, Ray said. We'll honor his service, remember his friendship, and carry his example forward in whatever years we have left. The meeting continued for another hour as veterans shared contact information, made plans for tomorrow's ceremony, and promised to maintain connections that might help them navigate the challenges of aging with military-related health problems. When the gathering finally dispersed, Ray felt the familiar weight of military brotherhood, the burden and privilege of carrying memories that civilian society could never fully understand. Returning to his room, Ray called room service and ordered a simple dinner that he ate while reviewing the notes he had written for tomorrow's graveside remarks. As one of Dave Mitchell's closest friends, he had been asked to speak during the ceremony, representing the enlisted soldiers who had served under Dave's leadership. The speech was brief and personal, focusing on Dave's character rather than his military achievements. Ray had chosen to emphasize the qualities that had made Dave an exceptional friend: loyalty, humor, generosity, and the kind of moral courage that extended beyond battlefield situations into the challenges of daily life. As evening settled over Arlington, Ray prepared for sleep with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring closure to one of the most important relationships of his life. The day had begun with corporate confrontation and unwanted publicity, but it was ending with the kind of military fellowship that reminded him why he had chosen to serve and why that service continued to define his identity decades after retirement. Outside his hotel window, the lights of Washington gleamed across the Potomac River, marking the location of monuments and memorials that honored previous generations of American warriors. Tomorrow, Dave Mitchell would join their ranks, taking his place among the honored dead who had earned their rest through faithful service to ideals larger than themselves. Dawn broke gray and solemn over Arlington National Cemetery as Ray stood before the bathroom mirror in his hotel room, adjusting the ribbons on his dress uniform. The reflection staring back showed a man shaped by decades of military service, the straight posture despite his damaged knee, the careful precision of his movements, the weight of responsibility that never quite left a soldier's bearing. His dress blues fit differently than they had during active duty, the fabric snug across shoulders that had broadened with age while his waist had thickened despite his efforts to maintain fitness. But the uniform still carried its power, transforming him from a retired veteran into a representative of something larger than himself. Ray's phone displayed several missed calls and text messages that had accumulated overnight. News of the airline incident had spread through military networks and social media, generating attention he neither wanted nor expected. He scrolled through messages of support from veterans he hadn't spoken to in years, expressions of outrage from civilian allies, and interview requests from reporters seeking to expand the story. One message stood out from the others, sent at 0547 hours from an address he didn't recognize. Master Sergeant Powell, I'm Elena Barnes, Captain Barnes's. Neat, sir. My father Luis told me about you before he died. Thank you for bringing him home. I'll be thinking about you today during Sergeant Mitchell's service. Ray read the message twice, feeling the emotional weight of connections that extended across generations. Elena Barnes was 12 years old now, according to Captain Barnes, old enough to understand the significance of her father's service and the debt her family owed to the soldiers who had served alongside him. A knock at the door interrupted his reflection. Ray opened it to find Master Sergeant Williams wearing his own dress uniform, ribbons and medals, precisely aligned according to military regulations. Morning, Ray. Ready for this? As ready as anyone can be. Transportation's here. Hotel arranged a shuttle for all of us. Ray gathered his dress cap and white gloves, the final elements of ceremonial military attire that would mark him as a participant rather than an observer in today's proceedings. The gloves were new, purchased specifically for this occasion, because his original pair had been buried with his wife 5 years earlier at her request. The hotel shuttle contained 6 other veterans, all wearing dress uniforms from different eras and branches of service. The silence was comfortable, born from shared understanding of what lay ahead. Words were unnecessary when men who had faced death together were preparing to honor a fallen brother. Arlington National Cemetery's main gate appeared through the shuttle windows like the entrance to sacred ground. The white headstones stretching across rolling hills created a landscape of geometric precision and infinite sorrow, marking the resting places of America's honored dead spanning generations of conflict and service. Section 60, where recent casualties from Iraq and Afghanistan were interred, occupied newer ground near the cemetery's southeastern boundary. The graves here were fresher, the families younger, the grief more immediate than in older sections, where Civil War and World War veterans had found their final rest. Ray spotted the gathering before the shuttle reached the designated parking area. Approximately 50 people stood in loose formation near a gravesite draped in military precision. Family members, active duty soldiers, veterans and civilians whose lives had been touched by Dave Mitchell's service and friendship. Sarah Mitchell stood at the center of the gathering, a woman in her early 50s whose strength was evident despite the sorrow etched in her posture. She wore a simple black dress with a small pin bearing her husband's military insignia, the only external sign of her connection to the deceased warrior being honored today. As Ray approached the gravesite, Sarah turned and recognized him immediately. Their embrace was wordless but profound, carrying the weight of shared loss and mutual gratitude for the years they had been privileged to know Dave Mitchell. Ray, I'm so glad you made it. Wouldn't miss it. Dave was family. He talked about you constantly, especially during his final weeks. Said you taught him what it meant to be a leader worth following. Sarah's words hit Ray with unexpected force. He had always seen Dave Mitchell as the superior soldier, the one whose technical skills and tactical instincts had elevated their unit's effectiveness. The idea that Dave had learned leadership principles from him seemed backwards, a reversal of roles that didn't match Ray's memories. Sarah, Dave was the best soldier I ever served with. I learned more from him than he ever learned from me. You both learned from each other. That's what made your partnership so effective. A young woman approached their conversation, her bearing and appearance marking her as military, despite her civilian attire. Ray recognized the confidence and directness that characterize professional soldiers, even in personal situations. Master Sergeant Powell, I'm Captain Jennifer Walsh, Walter, Reed Army Medical Center. I was on your flight yesterday. Ray remembered the captain who had accompanied Colonel Morrison, the military family who had been attending a different ceremony at Arlington. Captain Walsh, good to see you again. Sir, I wanted you to know that word of yesterday's incident has reached senior military leadership. The story is being viewed as an example of how civilian institutions sometimes fail to honor military service appropriately. Ray appreciated the information but hoped the attention wouldn't overshadow today's primary purpose. Captain, I hope the focus remains on honoring Sergeant Mitchell rather than dwelling on airline policies. Understood, sir. But the issues you experienced are part of a larger pattern that affects many veterans. Your visibility might help address systemic problems. Before Ray could respond, a ceremonial honor guard approached the gravesite with military precision. 8 soldiers in dress uniforms carried rifles and flags, their movements synchronized through countless hours of practice and dedication to honoring fallen comrades. The ceremony began with traditional military formality. A chaplain delivered opening remarks about sacrifice, service, and the bonds that connected military families across generations. His words were carefully chosen to comfort the grieving while acknowledging the unique nature of military loss. We gather today not just to mourn David Mitchell's passing, but to celebrate a life dedicated to principles larger than personal comfort or safety. Sergeant Mitchell chose to serve his country during dangerous times, accepting risks that most citizens never face. Ray listened to the chaplain's words while scanning the gathering of mourners. He recognized some faces from yesterday's hotel meeting, but others were new. Young soldiers who had served under Dave's leadership, family members whose connection to the deceased warrior extended beyond military service, civilians whose lives had been touched by Dave's friendship and example. Service members like Sergeant Mitchell represent the best of American values: courage, dedication, selflessness, and commitment to protecting others. His death reminds us that freedom's price is often paid by those who volunteer to bear its burden. The honor guard presented arms as a bugler played taps, the haunting melody echoing across the cemetery's rolling hills. Each note carried the weight of national gratitude and personal sorrow, marking the end of Dave Mitchell's earthly service and the beginning of his eternal rest among America's honored dead. When the music ended, Sarah Mitchell was presented with the folded American flag that had covered her husband's coffin. She accepted it with trembling hands, holding it against her chest like a tangible connection to the man she had loved and lost. Master Sergeant Williams stepped forward to deliver remarks on behalf of Dave Mitchell's military colleagues. His voice carried the authority of decades in uniform and the emotion of personal friendship. Dave Mitchell was the kind of soldier who made everyone around him better. He possessed technical skills that saved lives, tactical instincts that prevented disasters, and moral courage that inspired others to exceed their own limitations. Williams paused, allowing his words to settle over the gathering before continuing. But Dave's greatest gift wasn't his military expertise. It was his ability to see potential in other people and help them realize capabilities they didn't know they possessed. Ray felt the truth of Williams's observation in his own experience. Dave Mitchell had been instrumental in his development, from an effective soldier into an exceptional leader, offering guidance and support during the most challenging periods of his career. Many of us are here today because Dave Mitchell made us better soldiers, better leaders, better men. His legacy isn't just the missions he completed or the enemies he defeated. It's the positive influence he had on everyone who served alongside him. When Williams finished, Sarah Mitchell looked toward Ray and nodded slightly. He understood the signal. His moment to speak had arrived, the opportunity to offer personal testimony about the man being honored today. Ray stepped forward, removing his dress cap and holding it at his side according to military protocol. The gathering quieted as he prepared to speak, recognizing the significance of remarks from someone who had served so closely with the deceased. "Dave Mitchell saved my life more times than I can count," Ray began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled mourners. "Not just in combat, though he did that too. He saved my life by showing me what it meant to serve others without expecting recognition or reward." The words came easier than Ray had expected, drawn from decades of friendship and shared experience, rather than prepared remarks. Dave volunteered for the most dangerous missions because his skills could make the difference between success and failure, between soldiers coming home and soldiers being left behind. Ray's voice strengthened as he continued, finding the rhythm that came naturally when discussing subjects close to his heart. But Dave's real strength wasn't his marksmanship or his technical expertise. It was his absolute commitment to bringing everyone home safely, no matter the personal cost. The gathering listened intently as Ray shared specific examples of Dave Mitchell's character. Times when he had sacrificed his own comfort for subordinate soldiers. Occasions when he had volunteered for additional risks to minimize dangers faced by others, moments when his judgment had prevented casualties through careful planning and execution. Dave used to say that the measure of a soldier wasn't how many enemies he killed, but how many friends he saved. By that standard, Dave Mitchell was the finest soldier I ever knew. As Ray concluded his remarks and returned to his position among the mourners, he noticed movement at the edge of the gathering. A woman in business attire was approaching discreetly, her professional bearings suggesting she wasn't family or military personnel. Diana Russell stopped at a respectful distance from the ceremony, clearly not wanting to intrude on the solemn proceedings. When Ray caught her eye, she nodded slightly in acknowledgement, but made no move to approach or interrupt. The ceremony continued with final military honors, the presentation of medals and commendations Dave Mitchell had earned during his career, readings from letters he had written to family members, and personal testimonies from soldiers who had served under his leadership. A young sergeant, probably in his late 20s, stepped forward to address the gathering. His dress uniform was newer than those worn by veteran attendees, marking him as someone from Dave Mitchell's final years of service. "Sergeant Mitchell was my squad leader during my first deployment to Afghanistan," the young soldier said, his voice steady despite obvious emotion. "He taught me that being a leader meant making sure your people had everything they needed to succeed, even if that meant you went without." The sergeant's testimony continued with specific examples of Dave Mitchell's leadership philosophy in action, sharing his food with hungrier soldiers, giving up his sleeping gear to subordinates who needed rest more than he did, volunteering for extra duties to reduce the burden on others. "Sergeant Mitchell told me that the army would teach me how to fight, but only experience would teach me how to take care of people." He was right about that, like he was right about everything else. When the formal ceremony concluded, mourners began approaching Sarah Mitchell individually to offer condolences and share personal memories. Ray waited his turn, watching as Dave's widow graciously accepted expressions of sympathy while maintaining the composure that military families learn to project during public moments. "Sarah," Ray said when his opportunity came, "if you need anything at all, you call me. Dave was family, which makes you family too." "Ray, there is something." Dave left instructions about his personal effects, things he wanted given to specific people. "He left something for you." Sarah handed Ray a small wooden box bearing Dave Mitchell's name and military insignia. Inside, Ray found a combat knife, a set of sergeant stripes, and a handwritten note dated 3 weeks before Dave's death. "Ray," the note read, "this knife got me through 3 deployments because you taught me how to take care of my equipment and myself. I want you to have it as a reminder that good soldiers take care of each other, even after the fighting ends. Thanks for everything. See you on the other side." "Dave," Ray closed the box carefully, understanding that he was holding more than military memorabilia. The items represented Dave Mitchell's acknowledgement of their friendship and his desire to maintain connection even beyond death. As the gathering began to disperse, Diana Russell approached Ray with obvious hesitation about intruding on his grief. "Mr. Powell, I hope you don't mind my coming today. I felt a connection to Sergeant Mitchell's story after what happened yesterday." "Ms. Russell, Dave would have appreciated your being here. He believed in people who stood up for what was right. I wanted you to know that the airline incident has prompted some positive developments. Several major corporations are reviewing their policies regarding veteran accommodations." Ray appreciated Diana's update, but found it difficult to focus on corporate policy reforms while standing on the grave of his closest friend. The contrast between yesterday's airline confrontation and today's funeral ceremony highlighted the gap between institutional failures and personal relationships that sustained military communities. "Ms. Russell, I'm grateful for your advocacy. But right now, I need to focus on honoring Dave's memory and supporting his family. Of course, I just wanted you to know that your experience is making a difference for other veterans." As Diana departed and the cemetery grounds gradually emptied, Ray stood alone beside Dave Mitchell's grave for several minutes. The white headstone bore Minimal information, name, rank, dates of birth and death, military insignia, but failed to capture the complexity of the man being honored. Tomorrow, Ray would return to Arizona and resume his quiet retirement. But he would carry Dave Mitchell's memory forward, along with the renewed understanding that individual dignity and institutional respect remained worth defending, whether in corporate boardrooms or military cemeteries. The flight home would inevitably bring reminders of yesterday's confrontation, but it would also carry the weight of today's ceremony, the knowledge that some bonds transcend death and that some obligations extend beyond personal convenience into the realm of sacred duty. Ray returned to his hotel room, carrying the weight of the morning ceremony and Dave Mitchell's final gift. The wooden box sat on the dresser like a sacred relic, its contents representing more than military memorabilia. They embodied a friendship that had survived war, time, and now death itself. His phone had been vibrating constantly throughout the funeral, but military protocol had prevented him from checking messages during the sacred proceedings. Now, in the privacy of his room, Ray discovered the extent to which yesterday's airline incident had captured public attention. 17 missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize, 43 text messages from veterans organizations, reporters, and advocacy groups, 6 voicemails from television news programs requesting interviews. The story had grown beyond a simple seating dispute into a national conversation about veteran treatment and corporate responsibility. The first voicemail was from a reporter at CNN. "Mr. Powell, this is Sarah Chang from CNN Veterans Affairs Desk. We'd like to interview you about your experience with the airline and what it represents for veteran treatment in corporate America." Ray deleted the message without listening to the rest. The funeral had reminded him of what truly mattered: personal relationships, military brotherhood, and the quiet dignity of service without recognition. Media attention felt like a distraction from those fundamental values. The second voicemail was different. "Master Sergeant Powell, this is General Patricia Hayes, Arlington National Cemetery. I was present at Sergeant Mitchell's service this morning. I'd like to discuss something with you privately. Please call me at your earliest convenience." A general's personal call commanded attention, even in retirement. Ray dialed the number immediately, curious about what Arlington's commanding officer might want to discuss. General Hayes speaking. "Ma'am, this is Master Sergeant Powell, returning your call." "Master Sergeant, thank you for calling back so quickly. I attended Sergeant Mitchell's service this morning and was impressed by your remarks about his character and service." Ray waited for the general to continue, uncertain about the direction of the conversation. "I've also been made aware of the airline incident that occurred during your travel to Washington. The story has reached senior military leadership, including the Pentagon." "Ma'am, I hope the incident doesn't overshadow the purpose of my visit." "On the contrary, Master Sergeant, your experience highlights issues that affect many veterans, and your dignified response has created an opportunity for positive change." General Hayes paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. "I'm calling because the Secretary of the Army would like to meet with you before you return to Arizona. Not for publicity or media relations, but for a private discussion about veteran affairs and corporate accountability." Ray sat down heavily on the hotel bed, overwhelmed by the unexpected escalation from personal travel to cabinet-level attention. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm the right person for that kind of discussion, Master Sergeant. You're exactly the right person. You represent thousands of veterans who face similar challenges without advocates or visibility. Your voice could influence policies that affect military families for years to come." The weight of responsibility in General Hayes' request was unmistakable. Ray had sought anonymity and personal closure, but circumstances had thrust him into a position where his experience could serve a larger purpose. When would this meeting take place? This afternoon, if you're available. The secretary has a brief window between other commitments. Ray agreed to the meeting, understanding that refusing would mean abandoning an opportunity to advocate for fellow veterans who lacked similar platforms. The personal had become political, whether he wanted it or not. After ending the call, Ray discovered a text message from his daughter Jennifer. "Dad, saw the news stories about your flight. Are you okay? Call me when you can." Ray dialed Jennifer's number, knowing she would be worried about the attention he was receiving and its potential impact on his health and privacy. "Dad, I've been seeing stories online about what happened on your flight. Something about corporate executives and an airline captain intervening." "It's complicated, Jenny. Started as a seating dispute and somehow became a national news story." "Are you handling the attention okay? I know you prefer privacy." Ray appreciated his daughter's concern, but wasn't sure how to answer her question honestly. The attention was unwanted, but might serve purposes beyond his personal comfort. "I'm managing. More importantly, how are you and Tyler?" "We're fine, Dad. Tyler saw one of the articles and wanted me to tell you he's proud of how you handled the situation. He said it reminded him of the leadership principles they teach at West Point." The mention of his grandson's pride touched Ray more deeply than the media attention or government meetings. Tyler represented the future of military leadership, and his approval meant Ray had conducted himself in a manner worthy of the uniform he had worn for 32 years. "Tell Tyler that real leadership means doing the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient." "He knows, Dad. He learned that from watching you." After ending the call with Jennifer, Ray showered and changed into civilian clothes appropriate for a Pentagon meeting. The transition from dress uniform to business casual felt symbolic, moving from ceremonial military formality to the civilian world where veteran issues were often misunderstood or overlooked. A knock at the door interrupted his preparation. Ray opened it to find a young woman in military dress uniform, her bearing and insignia marking her as an aide to senior leadership. "Master Sergeant Powell? I'm Lieutenant Sarah Connor, aide to General Hayes. I'm here to escort you to your meeting." With the Secretary of the Army, the government sedan that transported Ray into Washington moved through traffic with the efficiency that characterized official military business. Lieutenant Connor provided briefing materials about current veteran affairs initiatives and pending legislation that might be influenced by Ray's experience. "Sir, the Secretary is particularly interested in your perspective on how corporate policies affect veteran dignity and access to services." Ray reviewed the documents while considering how to frame his experience in terms that might influence policy decisions. His confrontation with Douglas Fitzgerald and Christina Moore's initial demands represented broader patterns of institutional indifference that affected thousands of veterans. "Lieutenant, what kind of changes are being considered?" "Primarily legislative requirements for veteran sensitivity training in companies that hold government contracts and enforcement mechanisms for existing accommodation laws." The Pentagon's corridors carried the weight of national security decision-making and military history. Ray had visited the building several times during his active duty career, but always in subordinate roles that provided limited access to senior leadership. Secretary of the Army Margaret Foster's office reflected both military tradition and contemporary functionality. Awards and photographs from her own military career adorned the walls alongside portraits of previous secretaries and historical battle scenes. "Master Sergeant Powell, thank you for making time to meet with me." Secretary Foster was a woman in her late 50s, whose bearing reflected both political acumen and military experience. Her handshake was firm, her eye contact direct, her manner suggesting someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Ma'am, it's an honor to be here. Master Sergeant, I've read the reports about your airline experience and your remarks at Sergeant Mitchell's funeral. Both demonstrate the kind of character we need, representing veteran concerns in public forums. Ray accepted the compliment while wondering about the Secretary's ultimate objectives. Cabinet-level officials rarely met with individual veterans without specific policy goals in mind. Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm qualified to represent veteran concerns beyond my own experience. Your experience is exactly what qualifies you. You faced institutional indifference with dignity, accepted advocacy from unexpected allies, and used the platform to honor fallen brothers rather than promote personal grievances. Secretary Foster gestured toward a conference table where several documents were arranged. Master Sergeant, I want to show you something that might change your perspective on the importance of your story. The documents contain statistics about veteran treatment in corporate environments, discrimination in hiring, inadequate accommodation for service-connected disabilities, and systematic undervaluation of military experience in civilian workplaces. These numbers represent hundreds of thousands of veterans who face challenges similar to yours, but without advocates or media attention, Secretary Foster explained. Your visibility creates an opportunity to address systemic problems. Ray studied the statistics, recognizing that his airline confrontation was part of a larger pattern of institutional failure that affected military families throughout American society. What would you like me to do? I'd like you to consider testifying before a congressional subcommittee that's reviewing veteran accommodation requirements for government contractors. Your experience provides a compelling example of both corporate failure and individual dignity. The request represented a significant commitment that would extend Ray's involvement far beyond his original intention to attend Dave Mitchell's funeral. Testimony before Congress would generate additional media attention and transform him into a public figure advocating for veteran rights. Ma'am, I need to think about this. Congressional testimony would change my life in ways I'm not sure I'm prepared for. I understand, Master Sergeant. Take whatever time you need to consider the opportunity. But remember that sometimes individual experiences can influence policies that help thousands of other veterans. As the meeting concluded, Secretary Foster handed Ray a folder containing contact information and background materials about the proposed legislation. Master Sergeant, regardless of your decision about testimony, I want you to know that your service and your character have impressed everyone who has reviewed your story. The return ride to his hotel gave Ray time to process the unexpected developments that had emerged from a simple seating dispute. His desire for anonymity had been replaced by opportunities for advocacy that could influence veteran treatment throughout American society. Back in his hotel room, Ray found additional messages waiting on his phone. Marcus Thompson from the Veterans Action Coalition had called twice, requesting meetings about ongoing advocacy initiatives. Diana Russell had sent a text message updating him on airline policy changes that were already being implemented based on his experience. But the message that captured his attention was from an unexpected source. Master Sergeant Powell, this is Elena Barnes. I'm 12 years old, and my dad was Louis Barnes, who you saved in Afghanistan. I wrote a school report about military heroes, and I wrote about you. Thank you for bringing my dad home so I could meet him before he died. You're my hero. Ray read Elena's message 3 times, feeling the emotional weight of connections that extended across generations. Louis Barnes had lived only 6 months after being extracted from Afghanistan, but those months had allowed him to meet his daughter and create memories that sustained his family after his death. The phone rang, interrupting Ray's reflection. The caller ID showed a number from Phoenix, his hometown newspaper, requesting an interview about the airline incident and its aftermath. This is Ray Powell. Mr. Powell, this is Michael Stevens from the Arizona Republic. We're running a story about your experience with the airline, and we'd like to include your perspective. Ray considered the request carefully. Media attention was uncomfortable, but it might serve purposes beyond personal recognition if it drew attention to veteran issues. What kind of story are you writing? We're focusing on how corporate policies affect veteran dignity and the positive response from Captain Barnes and other passengers. We want to highlight both the problem and the solution. I'll talk to you, but only if the story emphasizes systemic issues rather than personal drama. This isn't about me, it's about how we treat veterans as a society. The interview lasted 30 minutes, with Ray carefully framing his experience in terms that addressed broader policy concerns rather than individual grievances. He emphasized Captain Barnes's leadership, Diana Russell's advocacy, and the positive response from passengers who witnessed institutional failure being corrected. Mr. Powell, what do you hope comes from the attention your story has received? I hope it reminds people that veterans have earned respect through their service, and that respect should be reflected in how institutions treat them. Corporate policies should accommodate military service rather than ignore it. After ending the interview, Ray sat quietly in his hotel room, processing the rapid transformation from private citizen to reluctant public figure. Tomorrow's return flight to Phoenix would mark the end of his Washington visit, but the beginning of a new role advocating for veteran dignity and institutional accountability. The wooden box containing Dave Mitchell's final gift sat on the dresser, reminding Ray that some obligations extended beyond personal comfort into the realm of sacred duty. Dave had spent his career serving others, often at personal cost. Perhaps Ray's unexpected visibility could honor that example by serving veterans who lacked advocates or platforms. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from Captain Kevin Barnes, the pilot who had intervened during yesterday's airline confrontation. Master, Sergeant Powell, this is Captain Barnes. I wanted to check on you and discuss something important. Captain, good to hear from you. Everything's fine on my end. Sir, I've been following the media coverage of our flight, and I want you to know that my airline is implementing policy changes based on what happened. We're mandating veteran sensitivity training for all customer service personnel. Ray appreciated the update, but wondered about the sustainability of policy changes driven by media attention rather than fundamental institutional commitment. Captain, that's encouraging. I hope the changes last beyond the current news cycle. They will, sir. The CEO has made veteran accommodation a personal priority, and she has the authority to enforce compliance throughout the organization. As the call ended, Ray realized that his airline confrontation had generated more positive change in 24 hours than years of quiet complaints might have achieved. Visibility, however uncomfortable, had created opportunities for advocacy that could benefit thousands of veterans. Tomorrow's flight home would test whether the policy changes were genuine or merely public relations gestures. But regardless of the outcome, Ray now understood that his experience had served purposes beyond personal travel, creating a platform for veteran advocacy that honored Dave Mitchell's memory and advanced causes larger than individual comfort. Ray arrived at Reagan National Airport 3 hours before his scheduled departure, carrying the emotional weight of Dave Mitchell's funeral and the unexpected burden of unwanted fame. The terminal bustled with typical afternoon activity, but Ray noticed an immediate difference in how airline personnel responded to his presence. At the check-in counter, the agent, a middle-aged woman with veteran service pins on her uniform, looked up from her computer screen with obvious recognition. Mr. Powell, I'm Linda Parker, station supervisor. We've been expecting you. Ray handed over his identification, uncertain about what expecting you might mean in practical terms. Just need to check in for my flight to Phoenix. Sir, we've upgraded you to first class as an apology for yesterday's incident. Captain Barnes personally requested the accommodation. The upgrade represented more than improved seating. It symbolized institutional acknowledgement of the failure Ray had experienced and the airline's commitment to preventing similar incidents. But Ray felt uncomfortable accepting benefits that other veterans might not receive. Miss Parker, I appreciate the gesture, but I'd prefer to fly in my originally assigned seat. If the airline wants to demonstrate change, it should apply equally to all veterans, not just those who receive media. Attention! Linda Parker's expression showed surprise at Ray's response, but also respect for his principles. Sir, I understand your position. However, Captain Barnes specifically requested that I ensure your comfort during today's flight. Ray considered the implications of accepting versus refusing the upgrade. Accepting might appear to validate preferential treatment based on publicity. Refusing might seem ungrateful for the airline's attempt to make amends. Miss Parker, I'll accept the upgrade if you can tell me what policy changes have been implemented to prevent other veterans from experiencing what I went through. Sir, all customer service personnel are receiving mandatory sensitivity training. This week, we've also revised our accommodation policies to prioritize medical needs over corporate convenience. The explanation satisfied Ray's concerns about systemic versus individual solutions. If the airline was genuinely implementing structural changes, his acceptance of improved treatment could be viewed as endorsement of those policies rather than personal privilege. In that case, I'm grateful for the upgrade. As Ray moved through security screening, he noticed TSA personnel treating him with unusual deference. Word of his story had clearly spread throughout airport operations, creating an environment where his presence was recognized and respected. At the gate, Ray found a quiet corner and opened Dave Mitchell's wooden box, removing the handwritten note his friend had left. Reading Dave's final words provided perspective on the choices he faced regarding congressional testimony and continued advocacy. Ray, good soldiers take care of each other, even after the fighting ends. Dave's message reminded Ray that military service created obligations that extended beyond individual comfort or preference. If his visibility could help other veterans, refusing that responsibility would dishonor the brotherhood that had sustained him throughout his career. Ray's phone rang with a call from Marcus Thompson at the Veterans Action Coalition. Master Sergeant, Powell, I hope I'm not interrupting your travel day. Not at all, Corporal. What can I do for you? Sir, we've been flooded with calls from veterans who saw news coverage of your airline experience. Dozens of similar stories, people who've been mistreated by corporations and lacked advocates to help them. Thompson's report confirmed Ray's suspicions that his experience represented a broader pattern of institutional indifference toward veteran concerns. What kind of stories? Employment discrimination, inadequate disability accommodations, denial of services that should be guaranteed under federal law. Your visibility has encouraged people to speak up about problems they previously endured in silence. Ray understood the implications of Thompson's information. His reluctant fame had created opportunities for advocacy that could address systemic problems affecting thousands of veterans. Refusing those opportunities would mean abandoning fellow service members who lacked similar platforms. Corporal, what would you like me to do? Sir, would you consider participating in a veteran advocacy summit next month? Your story could motivate policy changes that help people who've been fighting these battles alone. Before Ray could answer, he noticed a disturbance near the gate counter. A man in an expensive suit was speaking loudly to a gate agent, his voice carrying across the waiting area with obvious frustration. "This is unacceptable. I specifically requested those seats for my team's business meeting. Corporate policies should take precedence over individual passenger preferences." Ray recognized the scenario immediately. Another corporate executive demanding preferential treatment at the expense of other passengers' legitimate accommodations. The agent, a young man who appeared nervous under pressure, was struggling to maintain professional composure while explaining airline policies. "Sir, I understand your business needs, but we cannot reassign seats that have been reserved for passengers with documented medical accommodations." The corporate executive's voice grew louder, drawing attention from other passengers and creating the kind of confrontation that Ray had experienced 2 days earlier. But this time, Ray was positioned as an observer rather than a victim, with the knowledge and authority to intervene if necessary. Ray approached the gate counter, his military bearing and calm demeanor immediately noticeable to both the frustrated executive and the overwhelmed agent. "Excuse me," Ray said to the gate agent, "is there a problem I might help resolve?" The young agent's expression showed relief at the arrival of someone who might diffuse the escalating situation. "Sir, we have a seating conflict between business, accommodation requests, and medical necessity requirements." Ray turned to face the corporate executive, recognizing the entitled bearing and aggressive posture that characterize people accustomed to having their demands met without question. "Sir, I'm Master Sergeant Powell, retired Army. I experienced a similar situation on a recent flight, and I learned that airline policies prioritize medical accommodations over business convenience." The executive's expression showed irritation at civilian interference in what he considered a private corporate matter. "This doesn't concern you. We have urgent business requirements that justify seat reassignments." "Actually, it does concern me. Every passenger on this aircraft has rights that deserve respect, regardless of corporate influence or financial pressure." Ray's intervention attracted attention from other passengers, some of whom began recording the exchange with their phones. The executive seemed to recognize that his behavior was being documented and might have consequences beyond the immediate seating dispute. "Look, I don't want any trouble, but my company has significant business with this airline." "Sir, your business relationship doesn't override other passengers' legitimate rights. The agent is doing his job correctly by protecting medical accommodations." The gate agent, emboldened by Ray's support, addressed the executive with renewed confidence. "Sir, I can offer alternative seating arrangements that will accommodate your team's needs without displacing passengers with medical requirements." The executive accepted the compromise with obvious reluctance, recognizing that his aggressive approach had failed and that continued pressure would likely generate negative publicity. As he moved away from the counter, several passengers approached Ray to express appreciation for his intervention. "Thank you for speaking up," said an elderly woman using a walker. "I was afraid they were going to take my aisle seat." Ray's spontaneous advocacy demonstrated how his airline experience had equipped him with knowledge and confidence to help other passengers facing similar challenges. The intervention felt natural, an extension of military training that emphasized protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Boarding began 30 minutes later, with Ray among the first passengers to enter the aircraft. Captain Barnes was waiting in the galley, greeting passengers personally, rather than remaining secluded in the cockpit. "Master Sergeant Powell, welcome aboard. I trust your time in Washington was meaningful." "Captain, it was. Thank you for the upgrade and for everything you did 2 days ago." "Sir, your experience prompted policy changes that will benefit veterans for years to come. That's worth more than any individual accommodation." As Ray settled into his first-class seat, he reflected on the transformation that had occurred during his brief trip to Washington. He had departed Phoenix as a private citizen, seeking personal closure at a friend's funeral. He was returning as a reluctant public figure with opportunities to advocate for veteran rights and institutional accountability. Christina Moore appeared at his seat, her expression showing the same respect and professionalism she had demonstrated during their previous flight. "Master Sergeant Powell, can I get you anything before departure? Just coffee, thank you. Black." "Yes, sir. I wanted you to know that the sensitivity training we received this week was excellent. It helped us understand military culture and veteran needs in ways we hadn't considered before." Christina's comment validated Ray's decision to accept the first-class upgrade as endorsement of systemic change rather than personal privilege. If the airline was genuinely educating its personnel about veteran issues, his experience had achieved purposes beyond individual compensation. During takeoff, Ray opened his laptop and began drafting a response to Secretary Foster's request for congressional testimony. The decision had crystallized during his gate counter intervention. He couldn't ignore opportunities to help fellow veterans while maintaining personal anonymity. "Dear Secretary Foster," he typed, "after careful consideration, I accept your invitation to testify before the Congressional Subcommittee. If my experience can influence policies that help other veterans, I have an obligation to participate." The message was brief but definitive, committing Ray to a level of public service that extended far beyond his comfort zone. Military training had prepared him for personal sacrifice in support of larger missions. Veteran advocacy represented a continuation of that service in civilian contexts. Mid-flight, Ray received a text message from Diana Russell. "Saw news coverage of your Pentagon meeting. 3 major corporations have contacted my firm requesting veteran sensitivity consulting. Your story is creating ripple effects throughout corporate America." Diana's update confirmed that Ray's visibility was generating practical changes beyond airline policies. Corporate executives were recognizing that veteran mistreatment could result in public relations disasters and were seeking proactive solutions to prevent similar incidents. Ray's phone buzzed with another message, this time from his grandson, Tyler at West Point. "Grandpa, saw the news about your meeting with the Secretary of the Army. My tactical officer used your story as an example of leadership under pressure. We're all proud of you." Tyler's message carried special significance because it represented approval from the next generation of military leaders. Ray's actions were being studied at West Point as examples of how veterans should conduct themselves when facing civilian challenges. As the aircraft approached Phoenix, Ray realized that his brief trip to Washington had fundamentally changed. His life's trajectory, the quiet retirement he had planned, was being replaced by a new mission, advocating for veteran dignity and institutional accountability through public testimony and media engagement. The landing was smooth, and Ray noticed that gate personnel were waiting with wheelchairs and assistance for passengers with mobility challenges. The attention to passenger accommodation suggested that his airline experience had indeed prompted broader awareness of customer service issues. In the jet bridge, Captain Barnes approached Ray one final time. "Master Sergeant, I want you to know that your story has inspired changes throughout our industry. Other airlines are implementing similar policies, and veteran advocacy groups are using your experience as a model for effective action. Captain, the credit belongs to you for making the right decision when it mattered. I just happened to be the beneficiary of your leadership." Sir, leadership is recognizing when someone deserves better treatment and having the courage to provide it. You earned that treatment through 32 years of service to this country. As Ray disembarked in Phoenix, he was greeted by unexpected attention from local media representatives who had learned of his return flight. Rather than avoiding the cameras, Ray chose to address them briefly. using the opportunity to emphasize veteran issues rather than personal grievances. My experience with the airline represents challenges that many veterans face when dealing with civilian institutions, Ray told the reporters. The positive response from Captain Barnes and the policy changes that followed demonstrate that corporate America can do better when it chooses to prioritize respect over convenience. The drive home to Flagstaff gave Ray time to process the rapid transformation of his life and responsibilities. Tomorrow, he would begin preparing for congressional testimony that could influence federal legislation affecting millions of veterans. Next month, he would participate in advocacy summits that might shape corporate policies for years to come. But tonight, he would place Dave Mitchell's wooden box on his mantle beside the American flag that had covered his wife's coffin, honoring the memory of a friend whose example had inspired a lifetime of service and continued to guide decisions about duty, sacrifice, and brotherhood. The quiet retirement Ray had planned was ending before it had truly begun. In its place, a new mission was emerging, one that honored his military service by extending its principles into civilian advocacy for those who had earned respect through their own sacrifices for American freedom. 6 weeks later, Ray sat in the witness chair before the House Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs, facing a panel of congressmen and women whose questions would determine the fate of legislation affecting millions of American veterans. The committee room was packed with reporters, veteran advocates, and corporate representatives whose businesses would be impacted by proposed accommodation requirements. Master Sergeant Powell, began Congresswoman Patricia Walsh, the subcommittee. Chairwoman, thank you for traveling from Arizona to share your experience with airline accommodations and corporate treatment of veterans. Ray adjusted the microphone and looked directly at the Congresswoman, drawing on decades of military briefings to project calm authority despite the high-stakes environment. Thank you, Congresswoman Walsh. I'm honored to represent veteran concerns before this committee. Master Sergeant, please describe in your own words what happened during your flight from Phoenix to Washington. Ray recounted the airline incident with careful precision, emphasizing systemic issues rather than personal grievances. He detailed the corporate group's demands, Christina Moore's initial response, Captain Barnes's intervention, and the policy changes that followed. The incident itself lasted only 12 minutes, Ray explained, but it highlighted institutional failures that affect thousands of veterans who lack advocates or visibility to address their concerns. Congressman Michael Stevens from Texas leaned forward with obvious interest. Master Sergeant, what specific policy changes would you recommend to prevent similar incidents? Sir, 3 fundamental changes would address most veteran accommodation issues. First, mandatory sensitivity training for all personnel in companies holding government contracts. Second, clear enforcement mechanisms for existing disability accommodation laws. Third, recognition that military service creates both visible and invisible injuries that deserve institutional respect. Ray's testimony continued for 90 minutes as committee members explored various aspects of veteran treatment in corporate environments. His responses were measured, factual, and focused on practical solutions rather than emotional appeals. Master Sergeant Powell, said Congresswoman Maria Santos from California, what message would you like to send to corporate executives who might be watching this hearing? Ray paused, considering his words carefully. Ma'am, I tell them that veterans represent some of America's most dedicated and capable employees. We've been trained to solve problems, work under pressure, and accomplish missions despite obstacles. Accommodating our service-connected needs isn't charity. It's smart business that recognizes the value of military experience. Following his testimony, Ray was approached by dozens of veteran advocates, corporate representatives, and fellow service members who had traveled to Washington to witness the proceedings. The conversations confirmed that his airline experience had become a catalyst for broader discussions about veteran dignity and institutional accountability. Marcus Thompson from the Veterans Action Coalition was among the first to reach Ray after the hearing concluded. "Master Sergeant, your testimony was exactly what this committee needed to hear. Practical, factual, focused on solutions rather than complaints. Corporal, the real test will be whether Congress acts on these recommendations." "Sir, I think they will. Your story has generated more positive attention for veteran issues than any single incident in recent memory." 3 months after his congressional testimony, Ray received notification that the Veterans Accommodation Enhancement Act had passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan support. The legislation included many of the recommendations he had offered during his testimony, creating enforceable standards for veteran treatment in companies holding federal contracts. The bill signing ceremony took place in the Rose Garden, with President Harrison recognizing Ray's contribution to veteran advocacy during his remarks. Master Sergeant Raymond Powell's experience reminds us that individual dignity and institutional respect are not incompatible goals, the President said. His courage in speaking truth to power has created lasting benefits for millions of American veterans. Ray stood with other veteran advocates as the President signed the legislation, understanding that Dave Mitchell's funeral had ultimately led to federal law that would protect veterans for generations. The personal had become policy through a journey Ray could never have anticipated. 6 months later, Ray was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony for airline customer service personnel, completing the first mandatory veteran sensitivity training program. The event took place at the same Phoenix airport where his airline confrontation had occurred, creating a symbolic full-circle moment. Captain Kevin Barnes introduced Ray to the assembled trainees, many of whom were veterans, themselves seeking civilian employment in the aviation industry. Master Sergeant Powell's experience taught our industry that respect for military service must be more than marketing slogans, Captain Barnes said. It must be reflected in how we treat veterans as customers, employees, and fellow citizens. Ray's address to the trainees emphasized practical applications of veteran understanding rather than abstract principles of military appreciation. When you encounter a veteran passenger, remember that their service-connected injuries, both visible and invisible, are evidence of their sacrifice for this country, Ray told the group. Accommodating their needs isn't special treatment. It's earned treatment based on their willingness to risk everything for American freedom. Christina Moore was among the trainees completing advanced sensitivity training to become an instructor for future programs. After Ray's presentation, she approached him with obvious emotion. "Master Sergeant Powell, I want you to know that the training program has changed how I understand military service and veteran needs. My grandfather would be proud of the improvements we've made. Ms. Moore, the improvements happened because good people like you chose to learn and grow rather than defend past mistakes. Sir, I've been accepted for a position with the Veterans Administration, helping veterans navigate benefit programs. Your example inspired me to find ways to serve those who served us." Christina's career change represented one of hundreds of positive developments that had emerged from Ray's airline experience. Corporate personnel throughout America were recognizing that veteran service created professional opportunities to support military families and honor their sacrifices. A year after Dave Mitchell's funeral, Ray established the Sergeant David Mitchell Foundation, using proceeds from his book about veteran advocacy to fund programs supporting military families facing corporate discrimination. The Foundation's first initiative provided legal assistance to veterans whose accommodation requests had been denied by employers. Sarah Mitchell joined the Foundation's board of directors, channeling her grief into advocacy work that honored her husband's memory while helping living veterans overcome institutional barriers. Dave would be amazed by everything that came from your airline experience, Sarah told Ray during the Foundation's first board meeting. He always said that good soldiers find ways to keep serving even after they leave the military. Sarah, this foundation is Dave's final mission. Every veteran we help represents his continuing influence on military brotherhood and civilian accountability. The foundation's second year brought expansion into corporate consulting, helping businesses develop veteran-friendly policies that went beyond legal compliance to create genuine inclusivity. Diana Russell's firm became a primary partner in these efforts, leveraging corporate relationships to implement systemic changes throughout American business culture. Ray, your story has transformed how corporate America thinks about veteran issues, Diana reported during a quarterly update meeting. We've consulted with over 200 companies, and the changes are substantial and sustainable. Ms. Russell, the real measure of success will be whether other veterans notice improved treatment when they interact with civilian institutions. Ray's question was answered through testimonials from veterans across the country who reported better experiences with airlines, hotels, rental car companies, and other businesses that had implemented sensitivity training based on his recommendations. Elena Barnes, now 14 years old, sent Ray a letter describing how his story had influenced her school's Veterans Appreciation Program. "Dear Master Sergeant Powell," she wrote, "our school started a veterans mentorship program because of your example. Military families in our community are helping students understand the sacrifices that protect our freedom. Thank you for showing us that individual courage can create positive change." Elena's letter reminded Ray that his advocacy work was influencing not just current veterans, but future generations who would inherit responsibility for honoring military service and maintaining American values. 2 years after his congressional testimony, Ray was invited to deliver the keynote address at Arlington National Cemetery's Veterans Day ceremony. Standing before thousands of military families and veteran advocates, he reflected on the journey that had begun with Dave Mitchell's funeral and evolved into a national movement for veteran dignity. "We gather today not just to honor those who served, but to commit ourselves to ensuring that their service continues to be respected in civilian society," Ray told the assembled crowd. "Every veteran in America deserves the same dignity and accommodation that Captain Kevin Barnes demonstrated." On a flight from Phoenix to Washington, Ray's address concluded with a promise to continue advocating for veteran rights until institutional respect matched the gratitude expressed in Memorial Day speeches and Veterans Day ceremonies. "The measure of our national character isn't how we honor dead heroes," Ray said, "but how we treat living veterans who continue to serve their communities despite service-connected challenges." Following the ceremony, Ray visited Dave Mitchell's grave in Section 60, where the white headstone now bore additional engravings, recognizing his posthumous influence on veteran advocacy. The Sergeant David Mitchell Foundation had funded the memorial additions as testimony to his continuing impact on military brotherhood. Ray placed a small American flag beside the headstone and stood quietly for several minutes, processing the remarkable chain of events that had transformed a simple funeral visit into a national movement for veteran dignity. "Dave," Ray said aloud, knowing his words would be carried away by the autumn wind, "you always said good soldiers take care of each other. This is how we're taking care of the living ones." The drive back to his hotel took Ray through Washington, neighborhoods where veteran advocacy organizations had established offices funded partially by foundation grants. The visible expansion of veteran support services reminded him that institutional change required sustained effort rather than momentary attention. Ray's phone buzzed with a text message from his grandson Tyler, now a second-year cadet at West Point. "Grandpa, they're teaching your airline story in our leadership class as an example of how individual courage can influence systemic change. My tactical officer said you demonstrated that real leaders never stop serving, even after they leave the military." Tyler's message validated Ray's decision to accept public visibility, despite his preference for privacy. If his experience could educate future military leaders about the importance of veteran advocacy, the personal costs of fame were worthwhile. That evening, Ray returned to his hotel room and opened Dave Mitchell's wooden box, removing the combat knife that had accompanied his friend through 3 combat deployments. The weapon had saved Dave's life multiple times during dangerous missions, and now it served as a reminder that some battles continued long after formal combat ended. Ray's laptop contained the draft of his next book, focused on practical strategies for veterans facing corporate discrimination. The manuscript included case studies from Foundation clients, policy recommendations based on congressional testimony, and resource guides for veteran advocates working to create institutional change. The final chapter was titled "Bringing Everyone Home," using the Special Forces motto to describe civilian advocacy as an extension of military service. Ray wrote about the responsibility that veterans shared to support each other through challenges that civilians often failed to understand or address. "Military service doesn't end with retirement ceremonies," Ray typed. "It evolves into civilian missions that require the same courage, dedication, and brotherhood that sustained us during combat deployments." As Ray prepared for sleep in his Washington hotel, he reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred since his airline confrontation 2 years earlier. The quiet retirement he had planned had been replaced by a new mission that honored Dave Mitchell's memory, while serving living veterans who faced their own battles with institutional indifference. Tomorrow's return flight to Phoenix would be routine, characterized by respectful treatment from airline personnel trained according to standards his advocacy had helped establish. The journey would mark another completion of the cycle between Washington advocacy and Arizona retirement, between public service and private reflection. But Ray now understood that his true retirement would never come. Military brotherhood created obligations that transcended formal service, requiring veterans to continue protecting each other long after they hung up their uniforms. Dave Mitchell's death had ended one chapter of their friendship, but it had begun another chapter of service that would continue until Ray joined his fallen brothers in Section 60. The wooden box closed with a soft click, sealing Dave's final gift until Ray's next trip to Washington for congressional hearings, foundation meetings, or advocacy conferences that served the living while honoring the dead. Some missions never ended, some promises extended beyond death. Some brothers remained, connected across time, rank, and the boundary between life and eternal rest. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.